Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Today we will look into why humans are not adapted to modern life. Stone Age brains, urban world problems. Imagine the world 300,000 years ago. No highways, no skyscraper silhouettes, no hum of cars, only open landscapes interspersed with patches of forest and water, and rare rock shelters where firelight dances on stone walls. If you want to understand what kind of creatures we truly are, this is the best time for a visit. The modern world is cramped and bustling, but the human mind was not formed in it. It was created where survival meant belonging to a small group, where knowing every face could be the line between life and death. Therefore, the question we begin with is simple. For what world was our mind actually adapted? The answer lies in the lives of those early groups of Homo sapiens and their close relatives, who roamed the African savannas and wooded valleys between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago. They lived in groups rarely exceeding a few dozen people, 100 at most. Within these communities, most were relatives or, at the very least, considered as such. People ate together, gathered food together, and slept side by side in shelters or caves. Every person was woven into an unbreakable web of obligation and trust. A brain growing in such a social environment learned to track relationships, reputations, and alliances, because ignoring such things could mean exclusion from the group, which almost always meant death. The physical environment of those early humans was much more diverse than the cliques of endless savannas might suggest. Fossil pollen, animal remains, and sediment layers show that Africa's climate in that era fluctuated between wet periods, with forests and rivers, and arid intervals when steppes spread wide. To survive meant to be flexible. One season might yield roots and fruits. Another might require hunting antelope or scavenging the remains of a lion's kill. Fire provided warmth and protection, and caves provided stability during storms. But no one lived in one place forever. Camps moved following the rains, animal migrations, and the changing needs of the group. The mind adapted not to permanent homes, but to impermanence itself. When you think of a cave today, it seems like a relic or a curiosity, a place to visit on vacation. But for those people, a cave was something more than just stone. It was prime real estate. In regions like South Africa, rock shelters provided views of valleys, protection from predators, and stable temperatures in any season. Excavations in places like Border Cave or Clay's River mouth show layer after layer of ash, stone tools, and animal bones. These were not brief stops, but repeated returns by groups finding safety in stone. The cave became a kind of anchor in a changing world, and on its hearths, human conversation, laughter, and planning shaped the rhythms of life. And yet, life was never static. Unlike modern humans, who can thrive in huge anonymous cities, our ancestors' survival depended on close cooperation. Hunting large game required coordination and trust. Gathering tubers required shared knowledge of which plants could kill and which could nourish. Children required years of care before they could be useful, which necessitated collective investments far exceeding what most mammals demonstrate. The human mind became finely tuned to the nuances of cooperation. We track faces. We listen to tones of voice. We anticipate the needs of others, because for hundreds of thousands of years, this was not a luxury, but a necessity. Predators were a real and constant threat. Lions, leopards, hyenas, and crocodiles claimed lives. No less dangerous were injuries, infections, or hunger. A dislocated ankle could make gathering food impossible. A fever could sweep through an entire camp. It was only through the group's willingness to share food, carry the wounded, and care for the weak that individuals could survive. This constant balance between vulnerability and support carved deep paths in the human brain. Our sense of fairness, the resentment when others cheat, and the gratitude when others share can be traced back to these small circles of survival. There is also a rhythm to life that is now almost impossible to imagine. Days were limited by sunrise and sunset. Nights were long, dark, and filled with the sounds of animals. Stories, instructions, and plans circulated around the campfire. We cannot know their exact content, but we see the consequences in the endurance of oral traditions among later hunter-gatherer societies. Memory was collective, built not on books or screens, but on repetition, songs, and rituals. To forget was dangerous. To remember together was strength. The mind evolved not just to think, but to think socially, embedding knowledge within the group. It is easy to imagine early humans in constant struggle, but evidence suggests they may have had more leisure than many agricultural societies that came later. When food was plentiful, a workday devoted to gathering or hunting might leave time for rest, games, or creativity. Children likely grew up in multi-age groups, looked after not only by parents but by siblings, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, and grandfathers. Anthropologists call this alloparental care, and it is one of the reasons why human childhood could last so long. A child belonged not only to parents but to the entire camp, and this extended safety net left room for learning skills, testing imagination, and forging connections. Nevertheless, survival was precarious. Infant mortality was high, and life expectancy was short compared to today. Though not as short as commonly believed, many adults lived to 40 or 50 if they survived childhood and accidents. This means that elders were present in the group, sharing experience, guided young hunters, and remembering the last time there were no rains. The presence of grandparents might even have been one of the unique features of our species, allowing knowledge to accumulate from generation to generation. When we ask what kind of world shaped our mind, the answer lies not only in food and shelter. It is about scale. Humans lived in worlds small enough to be known. A person might never meet a stranger who could not be connected through kinship or alliance. The group's movements followed the patterns of the land, and decisions were made face to face. There were no faceless institutions, no anonymous crowds. Reputation was everything, and trust was the currency. This is the very brain we carry today, the one calibrated for proximity and immediacy. It is striking how resilient this brain has proven to be. It survived the climatic fluctuations of the Pleistocene, from lush interglacial forests to arid glacial steppes. It survived competition with other human species and formidable predators. It survived by clinging to cooperation, remembering danger, and investing in the slow and vulnerable process of raising children. And all this happened long before agriculture, before writing, before cities. We are faced with a disturbing question. If our mind was formed in those caves and camps among a few dozen familiar faces, how does it function today in a world of billions? Are the anxiety, worry, and longing that many of us feel simply echoes of that original environment? A mismatch between the cave that created us and the city that surrounds us now. Data indicates that this is the case, although we cannot be certain to the end. One can only say that the human brain is not a blank slate. It is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error, success and failure in a world very different from the one we live in today. We, as scientists, do not claim to know all the answers. The archaeological record is incomplete, and the fossils and tools we study are but fragments of much larger stories. But together they paint a picture of life connected by small groups, changing landscapes, and a constant search for safety in caves and fires. This picture may be incomplete, but it is enough to remind us. The mind you are using right now was not built for skyscrapers or smartphones. It was built for the cave. And this realization is the foundation for everything that follows. Have you ever noticed how easily your thoughts slide toward the worst outcome? You might replay a mistake over and over, or feel the pain of a minor insult much deeper than the joy of a compliment. You might worry about losing money more than you celebrate receiving it. This bias toward fear, caution, and loss is not accidental. It is not even a flaw, though in the modern world it may seem like one. It is the inheritance of a brain created for survival, not for comfort. And the question that brought us here is this: why is the human brain so obsessed with threats and losses? The deep record of our species between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago tells us that caution was not optional. In landscapes full of predators, poisonous plants, changing climates, and rival groups, recklessness or inattention often proved fatal. Natural selection favored those who quickly noticed danger, vividly remembered it, and passed that knowledge along. When studying hunter-gatherer societies and our primate relatives, a pattern emerges. Organisms devote more mental space to avoiding harm than to seeking pleasure. This is an evolutionary insurance policy. A missed lunch is an inconvenience. A missed snake is death. The mechanics of this can be seen in modern neuroscience. Structures like the amygdala, small almond-shaped clusters in the brain, are hypersensitive to potential threats. They flare up at the sight of angry faces or sudden movements at the corner of the eye. Experiments show that people remember negative words, frightening images, and the loss of money more strongly and longer than positive ones. This asymmetry is called negativity bias, and it shapes almost every interaction we have with the world. This happens not because our ancestors were pessimists. It is because the memory of pain kept them alive. Imagine a camp of early humans on a riverbank in East Africa. A group is gathering food, and a child picks berries from a bush. If one of those berries makes her nauseous, the lesson spreads quickly. The memory of which bush caused the illness will persist much longer and carry more weight than the memory of which bush gave the sweetest fruit. Eating again from the wrong bush could be fatal. Thus, negative experience gained greater stability both in individual memory and in group knowledge. The mind evolved not for balance, but for survival, giving danger special significance. This risk aversion was also evident in the hunt. When groups tracked antelope or large game, hesitation could mean losing lunch, but rashness could turn into a blow from horns or a trampling by hooves. Data from stone toolkits suggest that humans developed strategies balancing caution and opportunity, preferring to strike when conditions reduce danger. Spears, and later projectile weapons, increase the distance between hunter and prey, reducing the risk of injury. Every innovation was a way to reduce the likelihood of harm, rather than just making food acquisition more efficient. Obsession with threats also shaped social life. Conflict within a community could destabilize cooperation, and expulsion from the group was often a death sentence. Therefore, the brain evolved to track grievances, betrayals, and threats to reputation. Modern psychology confirms this sensitivity. Gossips spread faster when they concern cheating or betrayal than when they concern generosity. Early humans needed to remember who could be trusted when sharing food and who shirked their duties. Anger and resentment were perhaps emotional alarm signals that maintained fairness in fragile groups. Climate instability added another layer of pressure. The period between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago was marked by recurring fluctuations between heat and cold, moisture and droughts. Lakes in Africa filled and dried up. Forests retreated and advanced. Savannas expanded and contracted. For groups dependent on seasonal migration paths, a failed rainy season could mean starvation. Surviving such uncertainty required constant vigilance and the ability to anticipate worst-case scenarios. Those who underestimated scarcity left no descendants. Those who overestimated risk often survived. The legacy of this is our tendency toward over-preparation, hoarding supplies, and worrying about losses even in times of abundance. Archaeological data hints at this cautious mentality. In places like Olorgesailie in Kenya, caches of stone tools show not just random manufacture, but the systematic preparation of tools from materials brought from afar. This speaks to foresight, the awareness that a situation could become dangerous, and that preparedness is insurance. Carrying a sharp tool might have slowed you down slightly, but it provided protection against the unknown. In psychological terms, this is the ancient root of anxiety, a readiness system that assumes something might go wrong, and prepares for it in advance. Of course, the brain also sought rewards. The pleasure of ripe fruit or a successful hunt reinforced useful behavior. But pleasure alone was unreliable. It faded quickly. Danger left a deeper imprint, because forgetting danger was more costly than forgetting delight. Our ancestors could enjoy the sweet pulp of a fig, but they remembered for a lifetime which snakes nested in the fig groves. This imbalance is the reason why modern humans more easily list their failures than their triumphs, and why a single sharp comment outweighs many words of praise. Even sleep was shaped by threat. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that groups often maintain a staggered sleep schedule, where at least one person remains alert throughout the night. This watchfulness likely has roots stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Sleep could never be entirely safe, so the brain evolved to remain sensitive to sudden sounds or movements. Nightmares may also have served a specific purpose, rehearsing dangers in a low-cost simulation that prepared the sleeper for real threats. If you wake up from a dream about falling or being chased, you are feeling the echo of an ancient rehearsal system. The fixation on threats also explains much in the human art of storytelling. Around campfires, stories often revolved around cautionary themes, spirits in dangerous places, warnings about greed, or lessons about disobedience. These are not just cultural accidents, they are mnemonic tools. By weaving dangers into a narrative, communities ensured that the next generation would remember them. Even myths and legends, though we cannot trace their origins with certainty, likely carried the same weight. Stay with the group. Avoid the dark. Beware the stranger. Stories were the software for survival. The surprising thing is that this system worked well. It created humans capable of adapting to a changing climate, coordinating hunts, avoiding poisoning, and managing fragile social networks. But the price was a brain tuned to anticipate loss, conditioned to expect betrayal, and constantly scanning the environment for danger. In the modern world, this manifests as anxiety disorders, chronic worry, and stress responses that seem disproportionate. However, from an evolutionary perspective, they are exactly proportionate. They are a continuation of the work of a brain that never stopped putting survival above peace of mind. We cannot know in full detail how our ancestors thought. The record is fragmentary, and psychological experiments with modern participants are imperfect analogues for the minds of those who lived so long ago. Nevertheless, the convergence of archaeology, anthropology, and neuroscience paints a consistent picture. It is not a picture of rational calculations evenly balancing pleasure and pain. It is a picture of cautious creatures leaning heavily toward the negative, because those who leaned the other way often did not live long enough to pass on their tendencies. Therefore, when you find yourself fixating on mistakes or agonizing over losses, you are not broken. You are using a brain honed in a world of predators, poisons, and fragile survival. Today it may seem maladaptive, but for hundreds of thousands of years, it was exactly the tool required for the job. And this leaves us with a question that is both sobering and strangely comforting. If the very anxieties that trouble us now saved our ancestors then, can we ever truly expect to live without them? Or will we forever remain in the shadow of the ghosts of long-gone dangers, carrying within us a mind designed more for survival than for comfort? Imagine the entire span of 300,000 years, from the first known populations of Homo sapiens in Africa to the dawn of agriculture, only 10,000 years ago. Throughout this vast stretch of time, tools changed, the climate fluctuated, and landscapes opened and closed. But one thing remained strikingly constant: the scale of human groups. You were born into a circle of relatives, companions, and allies that rarely exceeded a few dozen to a few hundred people. This limit shaped not only how our ancestors lived, but how their brains learned to perceive the world. And here we ask that very disturbing question: were we originally programmed to truly know only 150 people? This number is not taken from myths, but from comparative anthropology and primatology. In the 1990s, British anthropologist Robin Dunbar noticed a pattern in primates. The size of the neocortex, the outer layer of the brain, responsible for social cognition and memory, correlated with the typical size of their social groups. Monkeys with smaller brains lived in smaller groups. Primates with larger brains could maintain larger communities. When Dunbar applied the same calculation to humans, the estimate was about 150. This, he suggested, is the natural limit of relationships that the human mind can track with genuine personal knowledge. Not just acquaintances or strangers, but people you know well enough to understand their reputation, kinship ties, and degree of reliability. Archaeology and ethnography confirm that this corresponds roughly to our distant past. Hunter-gatherer groups often consisted of small bands of 20-40 people, which merged into larger gatherings of about 100 or more for rituals, exchange, or joint hunting. At such scales, gossip was sufficient to maintain order. You didn't need written laws or police because everyone knew everyone. If someone cheated, the rumor spread. If someone proved themselves at their best, their reputation was solidified. The entire group functioned on the basis of personal responsibility, and memory and conversation served as the brand. Sites such as Dolmstornis in the Czech Republic, dating to about 30,000 years ago, show evidence of large gatherings. Hearths, ornaments, and remains of hunted prey indicate communal living that temporarily grew beyond everyday bands. But even then, the numbers fit within Dunbar's range. We do not see evidence of sustained populations in the thousands until agriculture made food surpluses possible. For the vast majority of human evolution, your social world was limited enough that you could recognize every voice in the dark. This limitation was not a matter of convenience. It is hardwired into cognitive abilities. Remembering who would you meet, who shared firewood, who quarreled with whom required neural resources. The human brain apparently evolved to juggle exactly the number of connections that allows for scaling cooperation without descending into chaos. Grooming, mutual cleaning, so important in primates, was replaced or supplemented by language. Conversations about others, what we call gossip, emerged as an efficient way of maintaining bonds. Through gossip, information about behavior spread faster than through direct observation alone. Someone could say, he shared his antelope, or she hid her nuts. These stories reinforced reputations and allowed the group to cooperate, without requiring every person to have personal experience with everyone else. The price of maintaining such a network is visible even today. Friendships fade when neglected because the brain cannot indefinitely track dormant connections. In ancestral groups, attention was focused exclusively on those whose actions affected daily survival. Strangers might be noticed, even welcomed, but they were not woven into the same tight fabric of obligation. The fact that our brains prefer intimacy to anonymity explains why trust still arises more easily face-to-face than through large impersonal systems. The 150-person scale also helps explain rituals and symbolism in archaeological finds, from ochre markings in Blombos cave to beads strung into ornaments. These objects could serve as markers of identity at gatherings that went beyond everyday life. When several bands met, visual signals helped track who belonged to which kinship group. Language reinforced the effect, but objects provided tangible clues. This was an early extension of memory, a way to increase the brain's capabilities without overloading it. There is also the matter of conflict. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherers show that disputes often arose within groups and could threaten cohesion, but because numbers were limited, resolution was possible through discussion, ostracism, or, in extreme cases, the splitting of the group. You could not simply disappear into an anonymous crowd. Everyone knew your story. This constant visibility encouraged caution in behavior, but it also strengthened bonds of trust. The scale of the group kept accountability at a high level. Even kinship systems reflect these limits. Many societies divide relatives into categories that go beyond nuclear families. Terms for cousins, uncles, and in-laws create a mental map that helps track obligations within a group of 150 people. Such categories make relationships manageable. You might not know all the details of your kinship with every person, but you know the category and the duties associated with it. This linguistic framework is another tool for stretching social cognition to the very limit of its capabilities. Here we must be careful not to present this number, 150, as if it were carved in stone. It is an average indicator, not a rigid ceiling. Some groups might have managed slightly wider circles, others smaller ones. Personality, ecology, and technology, all of these shape the possibilities. Nevertheless, the general pattern persists. The minds of our ancestors were not 2000s, but 200s. This range defined the scale of intimacy in which trust, cooperation, and shared memory were possible. The importance of this cannot be overstated. It explains why our ancestors could survive in hostile landscapes with minimal technology. They relied on cohesion, on the ability to know and be known. Every member of the group was a carrier of knowledge, and this knowledge was distributed through conversations and stories. When someone died, their expertise in plants or hunting could be lost, but in a small community, others often possessed overlapping skills. The network of memory was resilient because it was interwoven. This also highlights why betrayal was so devastating. In a group of 100 people, a single act of deception could echo for years. A thief or a liar was not forgotten, because memory persisted throughout a lifetime. That pain of betrayal we feel today may be an echo of those ancient consequences. To be deceived in such a group meant not just a loss of resources, but a breach in the very fabric of survival. When archaeologists look at the dispersal of early Homo sapiens across Africa, they see evidence of small, scattered populations linked by periodic exchanges of tools, pigments, and ornaments. This network of small groups maintained genetic diversity and cultural innovation without requiring massive cities. A tribe of 150 people was simultaneously self-sufficient and connected to the general tapestry of humanity. This was the scale at which intimacy met innovation. So what does this say about ourselves? It says that the brain with which you are now listening to these words was molded in a world where all your acquaintances could fit in a single clearing, at a single gathering by a riverbank, in a single network of shared meals. It says that our craving for gossip, our need for belonging, and our sensitivity to reputation are not quirks, but adaptations. They are echoes of a way of life that lasted hundreds of millennia. And it leaves us with a lingering question. If we were designed to know only 150 people, what happens when we live among millions? How does a mind built for face-to-face gossip navigate a world of strangers, institutions, and vast societies? The answer to that question lies ahead. But for now, we must remember, the tribe of 150 is not just a number. It is an imprint of deep time, a reminder that the scale of our mind does not always match the scale of our world. Looking at the paleontological record, it is tempting to search for that single trait that made us human. For over a century, scientists pointed to the skull, measuring brain volume and comparing the cranial capacity of ancient lineages. A bigger brain meant a smarter human, which meant higher survival. It seems like an obvious equation. But what if that isn't the whole story? What if our intelligence was not the cause of our survival, but a side effect of something more subtle? The question that is important here is this: what if our intelligence was merely a side effect of our capacity for cooperation? Between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were far from the only human form. Neanderthals lived throughout Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied the known expanses of Eurasia. Earlier forms of Homo still persisted in parts of Africa and Asia. In many of these groups, brain size was comparable to ours, and in some, on average, even larger. If survival were merely a contest of brain volumes, the outcome would not have been so one-sided. However, over time, only we remained. This forces us to ask, did something else play a role here? The data suggests that the strength of Homo sapiens lay not in raw intelligence, but in social cohesion. We were, simply put, a friendlier species of primate. Fossil and archaeological traces show that our ancestors' groups lived in a way that required complex interaction. Hunting large game was nearly impossible alone. Gathering diverse plant foods required a shared mental map of the terrain. A long childhood required care from parents, siblings, and elders. And when groups met, they often exchanged materials, pigments, and tools in networks extending beyond everyday contacts. All this points to an extraordinary stake in cooperation. The theory of self-domestication supports this idea. Over thousands of generations, humans may have been selected not only for strength or cleverness, but for reduced aggression and increased sociability. Comparisons with other primates highlight this pattern. Bonobos, often called the peace-loving cousins of chimpanzees, show how tolerance and play can maintain large, flexible groups. Some researchers argue that humans went further, weeding out the most aggressive tendencies through social punishment, ostracism, and a preference for cooperative partners. Over time, this could have tipped the scales in favor of those individuals who knew how to get along, share, and plan together. Intelligence, language, and culture flourished on this foundation. Archaeological finds confirm the cooperation thesis. In places like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dating back more than 100,000 years, we find evidence of shellfish gathering, the use of pigments, and complex stone tools. These activities imply not just technical skill, but shared knowledge and a division of labor. Gathering shellfish requires coordination with the tides and group planning. Pigments could have played a role in signaling identity between bands. Tools of standardized shapes suggest teaching and imitation. None of this thrives in isolation. It requires communities that value the exchange and transfer of skills. The very emergence of language may have been less about abstract thinking and more about managing social complexity. Gossip and storytelling allowed information about cooperation, generosity, or betrayal to spread. Once vocal communication could carry a reputation beyond direct observation, cooperation became an even more powerful tool. Language allowed groups to grow in size, maintain trust at a distance, and pass on knowledge through generations. The richness of our mind, therefore, may be the very framework that arose to support our unique life based on cooperation. Even genetic data hints at this path. Comparing humans with other primates shows differences in areas associated with social cognition, empathy, and face recognition. These are not the marks of solitary hunters, but of a species whose survival depends on the ability to read others. Emotional intelligence, the ability to interpret subtle signals in faces and voices, could have been just as critical for survival as physical strength. A person who could anticipate another's needs, diffuse tension, or unite a group could leave more descendants than the strongest fighter. Here one should be cautious. It is difficult to reconstruct the mental life of people who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. Fossils cannot tell us if someone was inclined toward cooperation or was selfish. But when we piece together the indirect evidence, long childhood, communal child rearing, exchange networks, collective hunting strategies, and cultural traditions, the picture consistently points to a species that made a huge bet on cooperation. Intelligence was not the spark that created cooperation. Cooperation was the crucible in which intelligence was forged. There is also the paradox of brain size. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, or even larger. Nevertheless, their archaeological legacy shows less evidence of long-distance exchange networks and fewer symbolic traditions. They survived in small groups, but perhaps they lacked the same scale of cooperative connectivity. This does not mean they were less intelligent in everyday life, but it suggests that Homo sapiens were more deeply involved in creating networks of interdependence. The advantage was not that we thought better individually, but that we thought better together. Consider the problem of survival during droughts. When the rain stopped, groups could perish from hunger unless they had allies in distant territories, ready to share resources. Archaeological finds of obsidian and shells moved over hundreds of kilometers show that Homo sapiens maintained such networks. Such cooperation requires trust extending beyond immediate relatives, and it is reinforced by symbols, rituals, and mutual obligations. It is in such spaces that our intelligence flourished, not as a solitary calculation, but as a collective achievement. The record of skeletal injuries adds another touch. Many ancient skeletons bear traces of serious injuries that healed. This means the wounded lived long enough to recover, which would have been impossible without the support of the group. In other words, people who could not hunt or gather food were cared for. Such treatment of vulnerable individuals is rare in the animal kingdom. It demonstrates an ethic of cooperation so strong that it redefined the rules of survival. From this perspective, even our weaknesses gain meaning. Human infants are strikingly helpless compared to other primates and require many years of care. This vulnerability forced communities to deepen cooperation, which, in turn, gave an advantage to those who were better at upbringing and planning. A large brain may have been, in part, an answer to the demands of raising and socializing children within such complex networks of care. Intelligence was not an isolated trait, but an emergent property of extended childhood and cooperative networks. This story humbles pride. Our species did not conquer the world thanks to the genius of loners. We were not the strongest, not necessarily the fastest, and we were not the sole possessors of the largest brain. We became who we are by becoming the most inclined toward cooperation. Our intelligence is not so much the crown of evolution, as it is a byproduct of a long process of learning to live together. The friendly ape is not the most flattering slogan, but perhaps it is the most accurate. And this leaves us with a question that leaves an unpleasant aftertaste. If our intelligence grew out of cooperation, what happens when that cooperation breaks down? What happens when groups disintegrate? When trust is undermined? When the bonds of empathy weaken? Do we still remain that friendly ape? Or are we living in a way that destroys the very foundation of what made us human? The evidence of prehistory cannot provide a full answer to this, but it reminds us that our mind is not just a thinking machine. It is a social engine, created to flourish in collaborative labor and malfunctioning when we grow distant from one another. Imagine the Earth in the period between 300,000 and 30,000 years ago. A map of humanity then would not have shown one species dominating all continents, but would have been a patchwork quilt of different groups of people dispersed from Africa to Europe and Asia. They were not creatures from science fiction or mythical beings. They were real populations of flesh and blood who walked, hunted, and raised children just like us. For most of our evolutionary history, Homo sapiens were not alone. The disturbing question is this: why are we the only ones left? The evidence of that well derives slowly, bit by bit from caves, riverbanks, and mountain valleys. In Africa, our own species took root as early as 300,000 years ago. As fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco show, these early sapiens had faces and brains recognizably close to ours, though not identical, and they lived side by side with other hominins whose bones are now difficult to classify. Meanwhile, in Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals flourished. They were shorter, more massive, with elongated skulls and heavy brow ridges, but they manufactured stone tools of high complexity, hunted large animals, and survived in icy climates for hundreds of thousands of years. Even further east, in the mountains of Siberia, another lineage left behind only a finger bone and a tooth in Denisova Cave. Thanks to these meager remains, we now know that Denisovans were a distinct type of human, adapted, perhaps, to high altitudes and the cold. In the record, they seem like ghosts, and yet, their existence tells us that human history was even more crowded than we once believed. And on the islands of Indonesia, the so-called hobbits of Flores lived until at least 50,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis were barely over a meter tall, and their brains were no larger than those of a chimpanzee. But they made tools, used fire, and survived among giant storks and pygmy elephants. Each of these species was human in the sense that they walked upright, made tools, cared for offspring, and changed their environment. But each of them was distinct enough to be considered a separate species, with its own evolutionary history. Neanderthals split from our lineage more than 400,000 years ago. Denisovans branched off from that same limb, but went their own way to the east. The people of Flores likely descended from much earlier migrants, who became isolated, and decreased in size over time. For hundreds of millennia, the planet was shared by all this diversity of humans. Each adapted to their environment. Each solved the problem of survival in their own way. What is striking is that for most of our history, this diversity was not considered something extraordinary. It was the norm. The last 20,000 years, during which only one species of human has walked the earth, is an anomaly. Before that, coexistence was the reality. Fossil sites show overlapping timelines. About 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals occupied parts of Europe. Denisovans remained in Asia. The Flores people lived in Indonesia, and Homo sapiens flourished in Africa. The world was a mosaic of people. Archaeological traces show that these groups were not primitive in the dismissive sense once imagined. Neanderthals used birch tar as an adhesive evidence of complex chemistry. They made jewelry and, perhaps, buried their dead. The Denisovans left little material culture, but the very survival of their lineage for so long in difficult conditions speaks to their ingenuity. The people of Flores, despite their tiny stature, managed fire and stone tools in an island ecosystem with formidable predators. Intelligence took different forms, and no single lineage held a monopoly on creativity. The coexistence of these humans raises deep questions about interaction. Did they meet peacefully, exchanging goods or partners? Did they compete violently for territory and resources? Archaeology gives hints, but rarely provides certainty. At some sites, tall traditions overlap in a way that suggests contact. At others, layers alternate, implying the replacement of one species by another. We only know that for tens of thousands of years, different species of humans encountered each other, sometimes in caves, sometimes on open plains. The fact that fossils of different species are found in close proximity means these encounters were a part of life. It is tempting to imagine this as a contest in which sapiens won due to superior intelligence, but such an explanation oversimplifies the facts. Neanderthals endured the cold steppes of glacial Europe longer than Homo sapiens have existed. Denisovans persisted in Asia in ways we still do not fully understand. The people of Flores held their niche on an island against incredible odds. Each of these groups was successful in its own way. The disappearance of all but one might not have been an inevitability, but the result of a combination of complex factors: climatic fluctuations, demographic accidents, diseases, and yes, perhaps competition with our ancestors. One of the striking traits of sapiens is their geographic reach. Fossils and artifacts show how our species spread across Africa, into the Levant, and later into Asia and Europe. Our populations may have been more interconnected, maintaining broader exchange networks. This web of contacts could have provided resilience, allowing cultural innovations to spread faster and groups to recover from local catastrophes. Other humans might have been more localized, more specialized in their adaptations, and therefore more vulnerable when the climate changed or new groups arrived. And yet, we should resist the temptation to write history as an inevitable replacement of one by another. The truth is that we do not fully know why these other people disappeared. Climate changes around 40,000 years ago were harsh, altering habitats across entire continents. The arrival of sapiens in Europe coincides with the disappearance of Neanderthals, but whether this was a consequence of direct conflict, gradual absorption, or ecological pressure, the details remain unclear. Denisovans vanish from the record with even less clarity. The people of Flores disappear at the same time, perhaps due to volcanic activity or under the pressure of incoming sapiens. Every extinction is a puzzle with missing pieces. Only one thing can be said with certainty: the world of many humanities was real. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were not unique in their humanity. They lived alongside cousins who walked differently, looked different, and yet lived full human lives. Standing in a valley in those times could mean meeting a group whose language was incomprehensible, whose faces were unfamiliar, but whose eyes looked back with the same awareness. Reflecting on this diversity changes our perception of ourselves. We are not the pinnacle of a steady climb, but the last survivors of a tangled bush of lineage lines. The disappearance of the others leaves us with a strange legacy, a world where being human seems like something exceptional, though the concept was once plural. This exceptionalism is fragile. If history had gone differently, we might today be sharing the planet with other species of humans, each with its own culture and worldview. The haunting question remains, why us? Why only us? The available data cannot give a single definitive answer. Perhaps cooperation gave sapiens resilience. Perhaps numerical superiority tipped the scales. Perhaps random catastrophes culled populations that were already small in number. We only know that by 300,000 years ago, the world that was once full of different people was left with only one species. The memory of the others lives on in bones, tools, caves, and islands, a silent reminder that our species is not an inevitability, it is an accident. The world of many people was their world as much as it was ours, and their absence is a part of what defines us today. When we compare ourselves to the other humans who once shared the planet with us, we do not look like the obvious winners. Neanderthals had a robust build and powerful bodies created for survival in cold climates. Denisovans, it seems, flourished in the difficult conditions of high altitudes. Homo floresiensis, with extraordinary ingenuity, occupied their niche on a distant island despite their tiny size. In contrast, early Homo sapiens were slender, less robust, and seemingly less specialized. So how did the least likely candidate for the role of human survive? In the period between 200,000 and 20,000 years ago, our species repeatedly went through trials. Fossil data shows that early sapiens were few in number and often confined to specific refuges within Africa. Climatic fluctuations threatened to fragment the habitat. Deserts expanded during arid periods, and forests retreated. Archaeological layers suggest the presence of bottlenecks in the population times, when our numbers could have dwindled to a dangerous limit. To an outside observer at the time, it might have seemed that we were the underdogs, clinging to life, while stronger or better adapted humans held their positions elsewhere. What set sapiens apart was not physical dominance, but flexibility. Our skeletons show that we were built for endurance rather than raw strength. Long legs and narrow hips favored persistence, hunting, pursuing prey over long distances, until exhaustion brought it down. This was the strategy of a patient opportunist, not a heavyweight fighter. Our bodies also tolerated a wide range of diets, from gathered plants to carrion and coastal shellfish. Finds at places like Pinnacle Point in South Africa show that by 160,000 years ago, sapiens were already exploiting marine resources, an unusual adaptation for humans of that time. Such dietary breadth gave us options in the face of environmental change. Flexibility extended beyond nutrition. Tool-making traditions in Africa demonstrate striking diversity and innovation. Stone blades, microliths, and projectile points appear in different regions, suggesting experimentation and adaptation to local conditions. Unlike the more uniform tools associated with some other human species, sapiens seem to have bet on variety. This constant mastery on the go was likely a survival strategy, allowing small groups to adjust to shifting climates and resources, rather than relying on a single way of life. Social networks further bolstered resilience. Evidence of materials like obsidian or shells moving over long distances points to connections beyond immediate groups. These networks could serve as a lifeline in hard times, allowing for the exchange of food, partners, and ideas. Small populations could easily vanish in isolation, but networks provided a buffer. If one region suffered from drought, alliances in another could offer refuge. This web of relationships, fragile but real, helped sapiens endure periods when extinction seemed a likely risk. Even our species' apparent weaknesses could become strengths. Our infants were exceptionally helpless compared to other primates and required years of care. This vulnerability forced groups to cooperate more deeply, strengthening bonds of trust and shared responsibility. Grandparents, siblings, distant relatives all played a role in raising children. This extended circle of caregivers likely strengthened social cohesion, ensuring that knowledge and skills were distributed widely, rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. In such systems, the loss of one person did not erase entire layers of knowledge. Adaptability also concerned habitats. Sites of fossil and artifact finds show that sapiens inhabited steppes, forests, coasts, and, over time, even deserts and highlands. By the period of 80,000 years ago, groups were already exploring routes out of Africa into the Levant. Although many of these early migrations failed or were rolled back, they show a willingness to move and test new environments. Over time, this exploratory drive gave us an advantage, allowing us to expand into diverse niches that other humans may not have attempted to master or were unable to hold. It is important to recognize how dangerous this path was. Genetic studies show that Homo sapiens populations passed through narrow bottleneck times, when only a small fraction of individuals carried the species forward. Survival was not guaranteed. Extinction was possible. The fact that we are even here is a reminder of how close we came to disappearing. Just like the rest. What exactly explains the ultimate resilience of sapiens, while others vanished, remains unclear. Climate shifts likely played a role, putting pressure on isolated populations. Small numbers make any species vulnerable to random catastrophes. Our broader networks and adaptability might have tipped the scales, allowing us to recover from crises where others could not, but it was never an inevitability. To consider Homo sapiens destined for dominance is to misinterpret the fragile accidents of prehistory. We were underdogs and survived through luck and circumstance, as much as through any innate superiority. Archaeological data reinforces this humility. Sites in Africa demonstrate recurring cycles of innovation followed by abandonment. Technologies appear, flourish briefly, and then disappear, suggesting that groups often struggled to maintain continuity. This intermittent dynamic is not a story of a triumphal march toward progress, but a story of small, vulnerable bands experimenting in fits and starts. Survival depended on persistence, not perfection. We must also consider the role of cooperation beyond kinship. While Neanderthals and other humans undoubtedly cooperated, archaeological hints of long-distance exchange among sapiens point to a special emphasis on building connections with strangers. This willingness to trust beyond the immediate family may have been risky, but it expanded the safety net. It also laid the foundation for cultural complexity, allowing ideas to spread and combine across different regions. So how did the least likely candidate for humanity survive? By being flexible where others specialized, by building networks where others remained local, by enduring scarcity with patience rather than brute force, by investing in vulnerable children and the elderly rather than abandoning them. None of these traits alone guaranteed survival, but together, they formed a model of resilience. And this leaves us with a disturbing reflection. If we survived not because we were the strongest or smartest, but because we were the most adaptable and cooperative, what does that say about our future? Do we still remain that underdog species, finding resilience in diversity and connections? Or have we forgotten the very traits that once led us along the razor's edge of extinction? The record of prehistory cannot answer for us, but it whispers a reminder. Survival is not destiny. It is earned, fragile, and never guaranteed. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers made a choice, or perhaps stumbled upon it, that changed the fate of our species. They began to sow seeds and tether animals. For the first time, humans attempted to make food grow where they wanted it, rather than chasing it where it roamed. This seems like the obvious beginning of civilization, a moment of invention that led to cities, writing, states, and everything we call history. But the question we cannot avoid is this: was agriculture our greatest invention, or did it become our greatest trap? The backdrop for this leap was the end of the last ice age, as glaciers retreated and the climate warmed between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE. New landscapes opened up in the Middle East, East Asia, Mesoamerica, and beyond. Wild grains, such as wheat and barley, grew in abundance in the Fertile Crescent. Herds of gazelle, sheep, and goats roamed the valleys and mountain slopes. Humans, who had long lived by gathering, began to experiment with more intentional care for these resources. Archaeological sites such as Jericho in the Levant and Atalhik in Anatolia hold traces of those first settled communities, their floors covered in grain husks and their walls decorated with images of animals. At first, farming might not have seemed revolutionary. It was a supplement, not a replacement. Groups still engaged in gathering, but they also planted seeds near camps and encouraged wild herds to linger nearby. Generations passed, and these experiments turned into commitments. Wild plants turned into cultivated crops. Goats and sheep were driven into pens and selectively bred. The transition was gradual, stretching over centuries, but by 8000 BCE, entire communities relied mainly on cultivated fields and herd animals. The apparent benefits were obvious. Farming could feed more people on the same territory. Surpluses could be stored for lean seasons. Populations grew, and permanent villages appeared. However, beneath this surface of progress lay costs that would echo for millennia. Skeletons from early farming communities reveal a paradox. Instead of robust health, many show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and disease. The diet narrowed to grains and the meat of domestic animals, losing the variety of wild food. Grinding grain wore down teeth. Dense settlements exposed people to waste, parasites, and epidemics. Where hunter-gatherers often enjoyed a diverse diet and mobility, farmers endured monotonous food and the risks of a sedentary life. Inequality also took root. Stored surpluses allowed some to accumulate wealth and power. Houses in Atalhik vary in size, indicating differences in status. Burials with jewelry and belongings point to emerging hierarchies. Farming created the possibility of abundance, but it also created the possibility of hoarding. For the first time, humans could be rich or poor, not just by skill or reputation, but by material possessions. Hierarchies solidified into structures that would later become states and empires. Violence also changed its scale. Hunter-gatherer conflicts could be deadly, but they were limited by small group sizes. Farming villages with stored grain and dense populations represented tempting targets. Fortifications appear in the archaeological record. Skeletal remains show injuries characteristic of raids and battles. Farming did not necessarily invent violence, but it amplified its scale and stakes. Protecting crops and territory became a new constant of human life. Disease is another part of the story. Dense settlements became a breeding ground for pathogens. Domestic animals carried parasites and viruses that could jump to humans. Archaeologists and geneticists now trace the origins of many diseases, tuberculosis, measles, influenza, to these early interactions between humans and animals. The proximity of village life, with livestock in yards and grain stored in granaries, brought new risks that no hunter-gatherer had faced. Nevertheless, the agricultural revolution spread from the Fertile Crescent. It radiated east into South Asia, west into Europe, and, eventually, across the entire globe. Independent centers of domestication also appeared. Rice in China, maize in the Americas, yams in West Africa. Everywhere the pattern was similar. Gatherers experimented, domesticated, settled, and grew. Everywhere, health and equality often declined, even as populations rose. Farming allowed more mouths to be fed, but not always well. The trap of agriculture was cunning. Once a community bet on crops, it was difficult to retreat. The population grew beyond what gathering alone could support. Abandoning the fields would have meant starvation. Communities locked themselves into cycles of planting, harvesting, and protecting stores. The flexibility that was once the greatest strength of sapiens narrowed to seasonal routines. Success bred dependence. And yet, from this dependence grew much of what we associate with civilization. Surpluses supported specialists who could build monuments, create art, and develop technologies. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. The first written records appear for accounting for grain distributions and taxes. The very foundations of history archives, laws, and states rest upon agriculture. The trap carried its rewards, dazzling enough to hide the costs. The bones of early farmers still whisper the truth. Compared to their gather ancestors, they were often shorter, less robust, and suffered from ailments. Their lives may have been harder in many ways, but there were more of them. From an evolutionary perspective, numbers matter. Agriculture succeeded not because it made life easier, but because it made life reproducible on a large scale. Populations could expand, and with expansion came irreversibility. Looking back, we must resist the temptation to declare agriculture either a triumph or a disaster. It was both. It gave birth to art, cities, and states, but it also introduced inequality, disease, and new forms of violence. It transformed humans from wanderers into settlers, from opportunists into workers. It was a leap too massive to be reversed. Once made, it defined the trajectory of our species, and so we are left with the haunting question: did we choose agriculture, or did agriculture choose us? Was it an invention or a falling into a trap? The evidence does not give us certainty. We can only say that the leap between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago was the most fateful turn in human history. It set us on the path to the overpopulated, complex, and conflicted world in which we live today. And it began simply enough with seeds thrown into the soil and animals tied with a rope. Imagine entering a settlement of mud brick houses 8,000 years ago. Walls pressed tightly against each other, roofs serving as streets, smoke rising from hearths that burned day and night. Imagine the smell of granaries, animals locked in pens, and neighbors whose names you might not know, even though their houses touch yours. For a mind that spent hundreds of thousands of years in small, tight-knit groups, this new way of life must have been overwhelming. The question arises: what happens when the brain of a caveman moves into cities? The roots of this transformation can be traced to the Neolithic. After the spread of agriculture changed landscapes, villages like Jericho in the Jordan Valley, by 8000 BCE, grew from clusters of houses into fortified settlements. Archaeologists discovered massive stone towers and walls, their evidence that people were already protecting grain stores and, perhaps, themselves from raids. Atalhik in Anatolia, inhabited from approximately 7000 BCE, presents a different vision. Dense residential quarters without streets, where people entered houses via ladders on the roofs. By modern standards, these were not sprawling metropolises, but they were orders of magnitude larger than the gatherer camps of our ancestors. For the first time, thousands of people began living together in one place. What did this mean for the human mind? In small bands, trust and reputation were maintained through personal acquaintance. In these early cities, anonymity began to creep in. Not every face could be familiar. Not every interaction could be tracked by gossip alone. This shift required new tools, rituals, symbols, and, eventually, institutions to regulate behavior. Temples were erected in settlements like Eridu and Uruk, not just as religious centers, but as places of storage, distribution, and power. Gods could provide a story, but the real function was social glue. Archaeological finds tell a story not just of innovation, but of stress. Skeletons from early urban centers often show higher rates of disease, trauma, and malnutrition compared to rural populations. Crowding increased the risk of infection by pathogens, and a diet dependent on grains remained limited. Workloads intensified with the development of irrigation and construction. The promise of abundance came at the price of hard labor and disease, and yet the system persisted because it supported a population more numerous than any previous human experiment. The stress of urban life is not something we can measure in bones directly, but indirect evidence is plentiful. Fortifications speak of conflict. Differences in burials suggest inequality. The distribution of luxury items reveals networks of trade and status. These patterns reflect a world where strangers live side by side. Competition for resources intensifies, and hierarchies crystallize. For a brain evolved for intimacy. This was a confusing new environment. Cortisol, the hormone that spikes during stress, would have been familiar to ancient farmers when facing crop failure. But in cities, it could become a constant companion, triggered by noise, crowding, and lack of security. Nevertheless, cities unleashed creative energy. In Uruk in Mesopotamia, by 3000 BCE, tens of thousands of people resided. There, on clay tablets, the first examples of writing were preserved, born from the need to keep records of grain debts and labor costs. In the same period, the wheel and the plow appear, technologies that changed transport and agriculture. Monumental architecture, ziggurats, temples, palaces bore witness to collective effort and power. None of this would have been possible without the dense networks of urban life. The paradox is obvious. Cities solved the problem of sustenance and organization for large populations, but they also amplified the very pressures to which our brains were not adapted. The transition from knowing every member of a group to living among thousands of strangers was not gradual in cognitive terms. Our neural circuits remained tuned to intimacy, even when our social worlds demanded abstraction. Trust shifted from faces to signs, from personal connections to symbols, seals, coins, and contracts. Law codes emerged to replace the judgments of elders. Even art reflects this tension. The walls of a talhik are covered with images of animals, hunting, and sometimes abstract forms. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals depicted scenes of ritual and power. These were not just decorations, but systems of meaning, reminders of a shared identity that could unite strangers. Symbols bore the burden of cohesion when memory could no longer manage alone. We should be humble in our conclusions. The archaeological record gives us only fragments, bones, walls, pottery shards, and we interpret them through the lens of modern science. But the general outlines are clear. The experiment with cities transformed human life. It brought scale and innovation, but also stress and inequality. The very success of cities in supporting large populations ensured their survival, even if individuals paid for it with health and stability. So what happens when the brain of a caveman moves into a city? It adapts imperfectly. Humans invent gods, laws, and markets to manage strangers. They endure new diseases and hierarchies. They find ways to live in noise and crowding, even when stress haunts them. And in doing so, they create art, writing, and monumental architecture. This experiment was not comfortable, but it proved to be durable. By 2000 BCE, urban centers dotted Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Egypt, and China. The era of the village was giving way to the era of the city. The haunting question remains: did cities liberate us or trap us? Were they the ultimate achievement of human ingenuity, or the environment most alien to the minds that built them? The facts point to both. Our brains did not evolve for cities, but cities became the crucible of our history. We still live with the consequences of this leap, still asking ourselves, did we become better because of it, or simply more numerous? The first cities are so compelling not just for their scale, but for their fragility. Archaeologists studying the oldest urban layers in places like Uruk and Mohenjo-Daro find traces of sudden abandonments, signs of floods, fires, or social collapse. These settlements were experiments. Unlike all experiments, many failed. Populations grew rapidly when harvests were good and trade was brisk. But when rivers changed course or drought set in, cities emptied. The experiment of urban life was never guaranteed. What survived was not an individual city, but the model itself. The idea that thousands of people could be gathered, organized, and provided for in one place. However precarious that idea might be, life in these early cities meant moving into a world where the sense of belonging changed. The gatherer's identity was rooted in kinship and the camp. The urban dweller's identity was tied to neighborhoods, temples, and, ultimately, states. New hierarchies emerged with elites, who claimed power through divine sanction, or control over surpluses. Common workers built walls and monuments they did not own. The shift from equality to stratification left its marks in graves. Some were buried with rich offerings, others with nothing. The city, for all its wonders, solidified the boundaries between people. And yet, despite all its flaws, cities created something entirely new: continuity. Knowledge recorded on clay tablets could outlive memory. Ritual calendars synchronized thousands of people across the seasons. Streets, walls, and monuments provided a sense of permanence that no gatherer camp could provide. The city became not just a place to live, but a vessel for passing culture forward. This stability, even when individual cities fell, ensured that urban life as a concept survived. When we look back at these mud brick walls and overcrowded courtyards, we see both the promise and the tension of the urban experiment. We see caveman minds stretched beyond their evolutionary comfort zone, improvising rituals, institutions, and symbols to cope with life among strangers. And we see the seeds of our modern world, fragile, stressful, unequal, but resilient. Walk through the ruins of Babylon, the streets of Rome, or the narrow alleys of medieval London, and you will see our species drive to build higher, denser, and more durably than ever before. Mud brick gave way to stone, and stone to wood and concrete. By 2000 BCE, humans were already erecting towers, walls, and temples that eclipsed everything known to their gatherer ancestors. By the start of the modern era in the 1700s, the outlines of the modern city, overcrowded streets, markets, fortifications, and palaces were everywhere. And yet, despite all these achievements, the bodies that brought us into this environment remained the same bodies shaped in the savannas of Africa. The question is, why do our bodies fail in the very worlds we build? The mismatch between ancient biology and urban inventions is most clearly manifested in health. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as mobile gatherers, walking long distances daily, squatting, climbing, and carrying heavy loads. Their diet was diverse, rich in fibrous plants, lean meat, and seasonal variety. When cities took over, the model changed abruptly. The diet narrowed to basic cereal crops, wheat, rice, and maize. These crops could be stored and taxed, making them ideal for sustaining large populations and states. But the price was a nutritional imbalance. Skeletal remains from classical Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe provide evidence of stunted growth, anemia, and tooth decay. The very success of agriculture and the density of urban populations gave rise to malnutrition. With the expansion of trade and wealth, another paradox emerged: excess. Elite classes who could afford sugar, refined flour, and meat in abundance began to suffer from what we now call mismatched diseases. Ancient texts describe gout, a painful joint condition associated with a rich diet. Obesity appears in art and in the skeletal remains of the elite. Diabetes was not named as such until much later, but conditions resembling it were recorded by physicians as far back as classical antiquity. Our bodies, tuned for scarcity and constant movement, malfunctioned when faced with excess and a sedentary lifestyle. The strain was not only metabolic. Skeletal data over the last 4,000 years shows a steady increase in spinal deformities, osteoarthritis, and degenerative joint diseases. These were the consequences of new labor patterns. Working in the fields in a bent position, hours of grinding grain, and carrying heavy loads in markets and construction sites. The hunter-gatherer body, built for diverse movements and endurance, was squeezed into the framework of repetitive agricultural and urban labor. The result was chronic pain and wear conditions familiar today in the form of back pain, joint problems, and postural strain. Infections also flourished in cities. Pathogens that could not sustain themselves in small mobile groups became endemic in large, dense populations. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and plague left their marks on bones and in historical records. Waste disposal lagged behind population growth, and water sources were easily contaminated. Hunter-gatherers faced injuries, predators, and rare epidemics, but urban dwellers endured constant exposure to a disease-ridden environment, for which their immune systems were not designed. Stress must also have been profound. In small groups, conflicts and competition could be managed face-to-face. In cities with thousands of inhabitants, noise, crowding, and anonymity activated stress responses designed for short bursts of danger. Cortisol, the alertness hormone, became a chronic companion. Archaeological evidence of stress is indirect, but the nature of skeletal lesions, tooth enamel defects, and written accounts of insomnia and anxiety suggest that urban life took both an emotional and physical toll. Our brains, tuned to a tribe of 150 people, now negotiated in markets among strangers and in hierarchies of kings. The mismatch is most obvious when comparing mobility. A gatherer might walk 1,015 kilometers every day, gathering, hunting, and visiting neighboring camps. City dwellers often spent long hours sitting at looms, hunched in workshops, or standing in shops. Bones adapt to activity, and studies of skeletal strength show a decrease in limb robusticity throughout centuries of urban life. Modern skyscrapers have their ancestors in the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the cathedrals of medieval Europe. But in all of this, our bodies remain tuned for movement across open landscapes, rather than confinement in vertical stone. It is important to resist the temptation of nostalgia. Life in gather bands was not a paradise. Infant mortality was high, accidents were common, and hunger was a recurring threat. But when we study the health costs of urban life, we see that progress came with a hidden burden. The body that once flourished through mobility, variety, and intimacy was forced to reconcile with immobility, monotony, and crowding. Our achievements in architecture and state administration have not erased our evolutionary heritage. The facts humble pride. We did not redesign ourselves when we built cities. We brought Stone Age bodies into an environment they were never intended to survive in. The consequences: malnutrition, mismatched diseases, spinal pain, infectious epidemics became the backdrop of civilization, and they raise a haunting question. Will we ever be able to build a world that truly fits the bodies and minds we inherited? Or will the history of our species always be a history of mismatch? A story of caveman minds and Stone Age bodies trying to survive in skyscrapers. The history of this mismatch is deepened by how unevenly it manifested across different societies and classes. The bones of the wealthy elite in ancient Egypt and Rome, for example, reveal signs of overnutrition, gout, obesity, and calcification of the arteries. Meanwhile, the bones of workers from the same periods tell a different story. Stunted growth from childhood malnutrition, tooth decay from a heavy grain diet, and joint damage from grueling labor. The same city walls that united thousands of people also created rifts between those who had too much and those who had too little. But both extremes of the spectrum suffered from consequences that their ancestors would likely not have recognized. Textual records add a human voice to these skeletal traces. Babylonian tablets describe healers treating symptoms strikingly similar to diabetes. Ancient Chinese medical texts discuss ailments associated with sedentary habits and overeating. Hippocrates himself warned against the dangers of luxury and idleness for health, presenting disease as a predictable result of a lifestyle far removed from the mobile, balanced existence of early humans. Again and again, physicians across different civilizations noticed that prosperity seemed to carry its own diseases, which did not afflict their poorer or rural neighbors. Archaeology also shows how cities amplified vulnerability to famine. Although agriculture provided surpluses, it also locked populations into a dependency on a narrow set of crops. Gatherers could survive a drought that killed wild grasses by moving elsewhere, but for urban farmers tied to their fields, it could mean starvation. Skeletons from periods of crop failure bear the unmistakable markers of hunger. porous bones due to anemia, slowed growth in children, and tooth enamel defects from interrupted development. In this sense, the skyscrapers of our imagination stand on a fragile foundation of grain bodies are always only one bad harvest away from collapse. And yet, despite these stresses, humans return to the city generation after generation. Why? Because the trade-offs offered something precious: continuity, innovation, protection in numbers. Even if bodies ached and diseases spread, the collective achievements of urban life, writing, law, art, architecture were undeniable. Humans proved their willingness to endure pain, imbalance, and disease for the promise of permanence and the security of belonging to something larger than a group of gatherers. This is a paradox that persists in our history. The body that weakens in the shadow of monuments is the very same body that built them. The mismatches were already noticeable by the time Hammurabi carved his laws, and the Colosseum echoed with the cries of the crowd. And the haunting question remains: if Stone Age bodies struggled to adapt to ziggurats and temples, how much more would they suffer in the towers of steel and glass that were yet to come? A familiar scene. You are at home at night. The lights are off, and suddenly you hear a sound in the corner of the room. Logic tells you it's nothing. A creak of a floorboard, a cat outside, wind at the window. Nevertheless, your heart pounds. Even in a world lit by electricity, we still startle at shadows. Why do modern people with streetlights and LED lamps still fear the dark? To understand this, we must take a journey back through the long span of prehistory. For more than 200,000 years, humans lived without artificial light, except for fire. Night meant vulnerability. Our eyes are poorly adapted to low light, and without vision, we lose our primary sense of control. Predators from lions and leopards to hyenas often hunted under the cover of darkness. Archaeological evidence of bones with cut marks at sites across Africa shows that early humans were both hunters and prey. Fire offered some protection, but it was never absolute. In this context, the fear of the dark was not irrational. It was survival. The nights of our ancestors were full of risks beyond predators. Snakes, scorpions, and insects were more common at twilight. Venomous bites could kill or maim, and night blindness made it harder to avoid them. Even the terrain itself was dangerous. A wrong step in the dark could mean falling into a ravine or spraining an ankle, which became a catastrophe for a gatherer. Throughout hundreds of millennia, darkness was associated with increased vulnerability. Those who felt anxiety at night, those who chose caution survived. Those who ignored the shadows often did not. This evolutionary legacy still pulses in our nervous system. Research shows that modern humans, even those raised in safe environments, demonstrate increased physiological arousal in the dark. Heart rate increases, startle responses sharpen, and the focus of attention narrows. Common phobias of darkness, enclosed spaces, snakes, and spiders manifest across all cultures, indicating deep evolutionary roots. These fears are not entirely learned from experience. They are prepared fears, biases imprinted into the architecture of the brain. Neuroscience helps explain how these ancient patterns persist. The amygdala region of the brain central to processing fear reacts rapidly to ambiguous stimuli, especially in low light. A shadow or sudden movement can trigger anxiety even before the conscious mind interprets them. This rapid response once could have saved lives, winning precious seconds against predators. Today, it can make a pipe creaking seem like an intruder. The brain's design prioritizes false alarms over missed threats. In the ancestral environment, such asymmetry made sense. Archaeological hints remind us how central darkness was to everyday life. Hearths and caves preserve evidence of constant maintenance, suggesting that fires were tended throughout the night. Portable torches, charred sticks found in caves point to attempts to push back the darkness. Even beyond the reach of campfires, myths and rituals of later societies often divide the world into light and dark, order and chaos, safety and danger. These cultural expressions may be echoes of that primal fact, that night was always a time to be endured, not embraced. The persistence of the fear of the night also reflects the role of memory. Negative experiences and attack in the dark. A venomous bite are remembered more strongly than neutral or positive ones. This negativity bias, which once served as a protection, reinforces our association of darkness with danger. Even today, children fear monsters in closets or under beds. Developmental psychology suggests that these are not merely cultural tales, but expressions of ancient precautionary mechanisms triggered by immaturity at a vulnerable stage of life. It is worth noting that the light of a campfire did more than just provide illumination. It extended social life into the night. Around the flames, people gathered, told stories, and sang. Fire may have mitigated the terror of the dark, but it also reinforced the idea that light is safety and darkness is doom. The boundary between the lit circle and the shadows beyond it became symbolic, a division between the known and the unknown. Our myths of demons and spirits lurking at night may be a cultural processing of this very boundary. Even as civilizations grew, the problem did not disappear. Ancient cities lit their streets with torches, but crime and danger still peaked after sunset. Roman writers described the fear of walking alone at night. Medieval cities introduced curfews. Bells marked the time when townspeople were supposed to be home. These practices reflect an enduring reality. Human senses and bodies were not adapted to darkness. Technology could mitigate, but not erase, evolutionary anxiety. Today, electric light has extended the day into the night more fully than ever before. And yet, the fear of the dark persists. People still avoid unlit alleys. They still feel uneasy in an unfamiliar forest after sunset. Horror films exploit this ancient reaction, using shadows and sudden sounds to trigger a physiological response shaped over millions of years. The mismatch is obvious. Our environment has changed, but the wiring of our brains has not. As scientists, we must remain humble. We cannot reconstruct every detail of how early humans felt toward the night, but the convergence of archaeology, psychology, and neuroscience paints a cohesive picture. Fear of the dark was adaptive. It saved lives and became deeply rooted in our biology. This legacy explains why we, with all our light bulbs and locks, still startle at shadows. And we end with a haunting question. If we still fear the dark in a world of electricity, what other ancient fears do we carry within us unnoticed? And how do they shape our behavior in ways that no longer match our surroundings? The shadows in a room may be empty, but the shadows in our minds are full of memory. We live in a world of nations, religions, sports teams, political parties, and countless minor affiliations. Billions of us walk the earth, connected by trade, the internet, and global institutions. And yet, despite this scale and presumed modernity, our minds still divide the world into us and them. We choose tribes, fiercely defend them, and often believe what our group believes even when facts suggest otherwise. The haunting question is, why do billions of us still divide into tribes? The answer lies deep in our evolutionary past. For at least 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in small groups where survival depended on cooperation. Loyalty to the group was not a matter of choice. To be cast out was to perish. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies note that group membership is maintained, not by contracts or written laws, but by shared values, norms, and beliefs. Gossip maintains reputation. Stories reinforce morals, and collective rituals mark identity. These mechanisms create cohesion. These same mechanisms also create clear boundaries between those who are one of us and those who are not. Our brains, it seems, are tuned for exactly this kind of loyalty. Research in social psychology shows that people prioritize group membership over abstract truth. In experiments, people often agree with the group's opinion, even if their own eyes tell them it is wrong. This bias makes sense when viewed through evolutionary history. A lone dissident in a small band might have been right on the facts, but if insisting on that truth led to ostracism, their chances of survival plummeted. Agreeing with the tribe even at the cost of accuracy preserved life. Truth was negotiable, Belonging was not. This deep logic still underpins much of human behavior today. Religion, nationalism, and political affiliation are modern manifestations of ancient systems of loyalty. The personal history of anthropologist Ella Al-Shamohi illustrates this clearly. According to her memories, she grew up in a conservative religious community where rejecting creationist views was not just a matter of disagreeing with science. It was equivalent to questioning the tribe itself. To her in her youth, scientists speaking about evolution were not just wrong. They were outsiders, members of a different tribe with alien values. Only through years of study, reflection, and a painful departure from her original community did she embrace a scientific worldview. Her story mirrors the general dynamic in miniature. Beliefs are not just individual choices, but social signals of allegiance. Archaeology also provides a glimpse into this tribal logic across ages. Different tool styles appear in different regions even when raw materials and environments were similar. The persistence of such differences suggests that cultural markers were maintained as signs of group identity. Beads, pigments, and decorations similarly carried symbolic weight, distinguishing one community from another. These were not just practical differences, but signs of belonging. Tribal identity was literally worn on the body. The costs of tribal loyalty are just as ancient. Conflicts between groups have left their marks in the form of skeletal trauma, fortified settlements, and later historical records. Defending one's tribe often meant aggression toward outsiders. Loyalty was the glue for survival, but it was also the fuel for violence. Our brains evolved to handle this tension, ready to cooperate within the group and wary or hostile outside of it. Even today, neurobiological research shows a stronger empathetic response to the suffering of one's own, compared to strangers. The design of the tribal mind remains stubbornly asymmetrical. We must be careful in our conclusions. Not every trait of tribal life in the past transfers neatly to modern behavior. Ancient bands were small, whereas today's tribes can number in the millions. Nevertheless, the psychological mechanisms remain strikingly similar. Whether it is a village, a nation, or a football club, the brain's neural circuits responsible for loyalty and conformity are activated in the same way. The resilience of tribalism helps explain why global institutions struggle to override local identities. The United Nations may represent humanity as a whole, but most people feel a stronger emotional connection to their specific nation, community, or faith. Evolution prepared us to invest heavily in small groups where faces are familiar and reputation matters. Global masses stretch this instinct beyond its comfort zone, but the mind returns to familiar patterns. We create subgroups within nations, factions within religions, parties within states. The tribe never disappears. It only changes scale. This persistence also explains why people often defend beliefs that seem irrational from the outside. Once a belief becomes intertwined with group identity, abandoning it feels like a betrayal of loved ones. Anthropologists studying climate change denial or vaccine skepticism note that for many adherents, the issue is less about data and more about loyalty to their group. To change one's mind would mean leaving the tribe. For a brain shaped in prehistory, this is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. And here the paradox becomes clear. Tribalism was once the glue that made survival possible, binding small groups through loyalty, ritual, and belief. In today's global masses, that same instinct fragments us into factions. Our Stone Age minds still crave belonging, even at the cost of truth. This leaves us with a haunting question. Can a species designed to live in tribes of 150 people ever truly think as a global collective of billions? Or will there always live within us a drive for division, a desire to sit by the fire with our own and see the rest of humanity as them? The evidence of prehistory suggests that the answer may lie not in erasing tribes, but in learning to live with them, recognizing the ancient logic that still shapes our modern crowds. 200,000 years ago, people gathered around fires to exchange stories, share warnings, and strengthen bonds. Today, billions of us sit behind glowing screens, scrolling through feeds, commenting, and sharing content. The technology has changed, but the impulse feels familiar. Social media promises connection, belonging, and information. And yet, it also increases division, fuels anxiety, and exploits our ancient vulnerabilities. The question is, has social media rewired our brains, or has it simply hacked our Stone Age minds? To answer this, we must first recall the role of communication in our evolutionary history. Gossip was not just idle chatter. It was the social glue of bands and tribes. Conversations about who cooperated, who cheated, who could be trusted, and who could not, allowed groups to grow beyond immediate observation. Gossip extended the reach of memory. Around the campfire, reputations were made and broken. The price of exclusion from the group was death. So people cared deeply about what others said. This sensitivity is still with us. Our brains are wired to pay attention to reputation signals, the opinions of others, and subtle group hierarchies. Social media platforms, since their emergence in the early 2000s, have plugged into these circuits. Likes, shares, and comments act as reputation signals, modern equivalents of nods and whispers by the campfire. Neurobiological studies show that receiving positive feedback on posts activates the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine. This effect becomes reinforced, encouraging further participation. However, the same systems are extremely sensitive to negative signals. Rude comments, public shaming, or exclusion from online groups trigger the same pain and anxiety circuits as rejection in real life. The digital campfire has become global, but the emotions it evokes are ancient. Negativity bias plays a central role here. As evolutionary biologists remind us, humans are wired to notice threats more often than joys. A rustle in the grass could mean a predator. Ignoring it could be fatal. Remembering insults more vividly than compliments once protected reputations in small groups. On social media, this bias translates into a disproportionate focus on outrage, scandals, and conflicts. Platforms that algorithmically promote engaging content often amplify anger and fear, because these emotions spread faster and hold attention longer. The global campfire, instead of soothing, often burns brightest on negativity. Polarization follows. When billions gather in digital spaces, we do not become a single tribe. Instead, the ancient mechanism of dividing into us and them asserts itself. Online, people coalesce into communities based on shared beliefs, reinforcing loyalty and identity. Dissenting voices are perceived not as alternative viewpoints, but as a threat to tribal belonging. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement inadvertently deepen this divide by showing users more of what confirms their existing views. The result is echo chambers that feel natural to our Stone Age minds, but are dangerous in a globalized world. It is tempting to see all of this as something unprecedented, but these patterns continue our past. Storytelling by the campfire also carried the risks of rumors, exaggeration, and conflict. Leaders could manipulate the narrative, and groups could splinter over disputes. The difference is in the scale. What used to happen in a circle of 100 people now happens among billions. The brain has not changed, the stage has. The costs of this mismatch are evident. Since the spread of social media, rates of anxiety and depression have risen in many populations. Constant comparison with the edited images of others fuels dissatisfaction. Sleep is disrupted by the blue glow of screens, and attention spans are fragmented under a barrage of notifications. These are not entirely new problems. Humans have always compared themselves to others, competed, and worried. But the intensity and ubiquity of this are new. Our brains, evolved for leisurely campfire conversations, now struggle with flows of information, much of which is designed to exploit our biases. Nevertheless, we must be careful not to paint a one-sided picture. Social media has also enabled new forms of cooperation. Dispersed families stay in touch, marginalized groups find platforms, and collective action can be mobilized across continents. The same ancient impulses for gossip and belonging that can divide also allow for solidarity. like the fire that could both warm and burn. The digital campfire is an evolutionary double-edged sword. What is striking is not that social media changed us, but how well it fit us. It integrated into pre-existing circuits of reputation, reward, and fear. It didn't need to rewire our brains, it only needed to exploit what was already there. This is why it spread so fast, why it is addictive, and why it provokes emotions that feel older than the internet itself. The haunting question is not whether social media made us different, but whether we can consciously shape its use to fit our brain's capabilities. Can a species designed for campfire gossip learn to manage gossip on a planetary scale? Or will we always risk ancient instincts, amplified by modern tools, destabilizing the very societies those tools were meant to connect? Perhaps the most telling thing about the digital campfire is how quickly it colonized the rhythms of our lives. Archaeologists measure cultural transitions in centuries or millennia. Agriculture took thousands of years to spread. Urbanization unfolded slowly in regions. Social media, by contrast, went from a novelty to near universal reach in just 2 decades. This speed is not evidence of rewiring, but proof of fit. The platform that most successfully harnessed our ancient instincts spread like wildfire, because it resonated with what the mind already wanted to do: observe, compare, belong, exclude. The metrics of this fit are visible in the time spent. Groups of gatherers could devote hours every evening to conversations by firelight. Today, users spend comparable periods of time scrolling, liking, and posting. The difference is not in duration, but in reach. Campfire talk involved familiar faces, voices, and contexts. Online interaction involves strangers, celebrities, and carefully curated fragments, often stripped of the cues that normally regulate human interaction: tone, gesture, context. Our brains react as if the stakes are the same, generating joy or shame, a sense of belonging or alienation. But the volume is multiplied to a level our nervous systems were never designed for. The way information spreads also reveals this mismatch. By the fire, a rumor could reach dozens of people overnight. Online, it can reach millions in minutes. The brain reacts as if it hears this from kin, even if the source is anonymous. Anger, laughter, fear, everything spreads through networks designed to amplify attention, not truth. This is not new behavior. This is ancient behavior, scaled to a planetary system. That is why the digital campfire feels both familiar and overwhelming. And perhaps the most sobering realization is that none of this was consciously designed to destabilize us. Platforms evolved through trial and error, much like tools in prehistory. Features that triggered more engagement, like buttons, infinite feeds. Algorithmic selections were selected because they fit our brains so effectively. However, the result is that our deepest evolutionary biases now operate in an environment where they are constantly activated with almost no respite. For a nervous system designed for a tribe of 150 people, the result is exhaustion. We are left with a paradox as old as humanity. Fire gave us warmth, stories, and safety, but it could also burn, spread, and consume. Social media is the same. A campfire that connects people across the planet, but threatens to incinerate the very connections it was meant to strengthen. The challenge is not to abandon the fire, but to learn, perhaps for the first time in our history, how to regulate ancient instinct on a global scale. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, millions of people around the world began to notice something strange. Their thumbs ached, their wrists tingled, and their fingers cramped after long days with small devices. Doctors gave the problem a name: BlackBerry thumb, after a popular handheld phone. And it soon became synonymous with a new kind of evolutionary mismatch. Our ancestors' hands were honed to throw spears, grip tools, and weave baskets. They were not designed to swipe, scroll, and tap thousands of times a day. The question is, why are phones breaking our bodies? Anatomy provides part of the answer. The human hand is an evolutionary marvel. Opposable thumbs, fine motor skills, and sensitive fingertips made tool-making and symbolic expression possible. But these abilities developed under conditions of diverse and periodic use. A day in the life of a gatherer involved walking, carrying heavy loads, digging, throwing, and gesturing actions that distributed mechanical stress across many joints and muscles. Repetitive movements were present, but not in the relentless, uniform form that modern devices demand. When mobile phones entered daily life at the end of the 20th century, the scale of repetitive movements changed. Text messaging required rapid thumb movements, often at awkward angles. Later, touchscreens demanded constant swiping and tapping, concentrating stress on small tendons and joints. Medical reports from the early 2000s describe an increase in cases of tendinitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, and repetitive strain injuries linked directly to portable devices. Our anatomy, flexible but limited, had no time to adapt. A span of 2 decades is a blink compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that went into shaping the hand. The problem is not only mechanical. Prolonged device use changes posture, pulling shoulders forward and tilting the neck down. Tech neck, as some clinicians call it, puts a strain on vertebrae and muscles unaccustomed to such long-term static angles. Eye fatigue adds another layer. Gatherers evolved to scan landscapes at various distances. Now, we focus centimeters from our faces for hours, exposed to blue light that disrupts circadian rhythms. Again, the body has no evolutionary preparation for such an environment. Statistics highlight the scale of the mismatch. Surveys from the 2010s showed that teenagers send thousands of text messages a month, sometimes hundreds a day. Adults also increasingly rely on devices for work, navigation, and communication. Orthopedic clinics have reported a sharp rise in repetitive strain injuries among young people. Conditions that used to be associated with factory or office labor are now appearing in school children. Devices did not redesign our bodies. They simply exploited them beyond their design capabilities. This does not mean that evolution never prepared us for endurance. The human body excels at long walks, long-distance running, and flexible problem-solving. But there are thresholds. A thumb that is excellent at gripping tools is not adapted to 20,000 microswipes in a single week. A spine that supports diverse movements fails before endless slouching. We are Stone Age bodies faced with demands that did not exist in the lives of our ancestors. There is also a social dimension. Injuries of this kind are often ignored because they lack dramatic visibility. A dislocated ankle or a broken bone is obvious. An inflamed tendon is not. Nevertheless, for the sufferers, the consequences are real. Chronic pain, reduced mobility, and sleep disturbance. Archaeologists remind us that the skeletons of early farmers bear marks of wear and tear from grinding grain, just as medieval scribes demonstrate the strain of constant writing. Today our strain is digital. Different tools, the same pattern. Our bodies pay the price for new cultural practices. The story is still unfolding. Voice recognition, haptic feedback, and new interfaces may change how we interact with technology, distributing the load across the body more evenly. But for now, the facts suggest that our hands, eyes, and spines are in conflict with the devices on which we depend. We cannot evolve fast enough to keep up with them. And so we come to the haunting question. If phones are already breaking our bodies in just a few decades, what will happen when devices become even more integrated into our daily lives? Are we witnessing only the first wave of mismatches, to be followed by even more serious costs? Or will we be able to learn, unlike many previous cases, to design tools with the limitations of our ancient anatomy in mind? The answer is not yet clear. One thing is clear. Our thumbs, those little miracles of evolution, were created to encompass the world, not to endlessly scroll through it. If you step back and look at the conditions of human life in the 21st century, the picture seems surprising. Most people today are unlikely to be killed by wild animals. Famine, although it still exists in some places, is rarer than ever before. Medicine can treat infections that once wiped entire villages off the face of the earth. Infant survival rates are higher than in any other period of history. Nevertheless, according to surveys in various countries, people report unprecedented levels of anxiety, stress, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. The haunting question is, why do the most secure people in history feel the most insecure? The answer lies in the mismatch between the ancient mind and modern abundance. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in conditions of scarcity. Food was an uncertainty, danger was immediate, and survival depended on vigilance. Evolution selected full nervous systems that prioritized threats over comfort. Remembering the path where a lion lurked was more important than enjoying the clearing where berries grew. Worrying about tomorrow's hunger was more important than enjoying today's satiety. These tendencies, adaptive in a world of scarcity, now persist in a world of abundance. Psychologists call this negativity bias. Experiments consistently show that people react more strongly to losses than to equivalent gains. Losing $50 feels more painful than gaining $50 feels pleasant. This asymmetry echoes our evolutionary past, when a single mistake, eating the wrong plant, ignoring a warning sound, could be fatal. Natural selection favored those who chose the side of caution. In the modern world, the same bias fuels anxiety about finances, health, and status. Even when material conditions are secure, status adds another layer. In small groups, social rank influenced access to resources and partners. Exclusion from the group or loss of prestige could reduce the chances of survival. Therefore, our brains evolved to obsessively track relative position. Anthropologists studying groups of gatherers note that gossip often focuses on fairness, sharing, and reputation. In today's societies of millions of people, there is no off switch for this vigilance. Social comparison now extends to strangers, celebrities, and edited images online. Even in abundance, people feel deprived because they are programmed to evaluate themselves in comparison with others. Status anxiety is a Stone Age adaptation malfunctioning in the 21st century. Another factor is unpredictability. Gatherers faced uncertainty daily, but they managed it through systems of immediate return. Food was gathered and eaten within a few days, and trust was maintained through sharing. Modern humans, by contrast, face abstract uncertainties. Markets, careers, pensions, global politics. The scale of unpredictability overwhelms systems designed for tangible threats. The result is chronic stress and ancient fight or flight response triggered by invisible forces, such as interest rates or job security. Biology confirms this damage. Cortisol, a hormone that spikes during stress, is designed for short-term bursts. In the ancestral environment, it prepared the body to fight predators or flee from danger. Today, it is often chronically elevated, which is linked to insomnia, weight gain, weakened immunity, and mood disorders. The most secure people in history carry the biochemical signs of constant anxiety, not because lions are hiding in the grass, but because emails, deadlines, and imaginary losses keep ancient circuits running without stop. It is important to avoid simple nostalgia. Life in the past was not free from anxieties. Hunter-gatherers worried about hunger, injuries, and intergroup conflicts. But their stress was acute and episodic. It resolved when the danger passed. Modern stress is diffuse and prolonged. Instead of sharp spikes, we endure a drip feed of worry that almost never turns off. This chronicity may explain why anxiety disorders are among the most common mental health conditions worldwide today. The paradox is most evident in affluent societies. Here, people enjoy unprecedented life expectancy, an excess of calories, and technological conveniences, yet they report high levels of dissatisfaction and fear. An evolutionary lens helps to understand this contradiction. A mind molded to anticipate scarcity cannot simply switch off in abundance. Instead, it redirects vigilance toward relative deprivation and imaginary threats. The safer the environment, the more space there is for abstract words to fill the void. This does not mean that anxiety is meaningless. The same vigilance that malfunctions in abundance also fuels innovation, planning, and cooperation. A nervous system that cannot fully relax remains motivated to solve problems. But the price is obvious. Rising rates of burnout, insomnia, and stress-related illnesses testify to the mismatch. We are bodies created for scarcity, now living in abundance. And our minds have not yet caught up with reality. And so we return to the haunting question. If our ancient stress systems cannot find peace in plenty, will they ever be able to find it at all? Or is anxiety doomed to haunt humanity, as long as a Stone Age brain manages the modern world of skyscrapers, supermarkets, and screens? The data to date suggests that fear was never supposed to disappear. It was supposed to keep us alive. What it was never supposed to do was follow us endlessly into abundance. What further complicates the story of modern anxiety is that security itself has become strangely invisible. Throughout most of human history, the absence of danger was fleeting, never guaranteed. A quiet night could always be interrupted by a predator, an enemy, or a sudden storm. Today, systems of law, medicine, and infrastructure protect most people from these acute threats so consistently that we rarely notice them. Roads are paved, water is purified, and police or hospitals respond to emergencies. But because our nervous systems evolved to scan for what might go wrong, rather than what reliably goes right, security fades into the background. What becomes noticeable are the gaps. Rare crimes, occasional accidents, headlines about disasters. The very rarity of these events amplifies their psychological impact, making modern people feel more vulnerable than they actually are. There is also the irony of abundance itself. A supermarket shelf piled with food might seem like the complete opposite of scarcity. However, behavioral economics shows that too much choice can increase anxiety. In ancestral conditions, a decision was often binary: to eat or not to eat, to fight or to flee. Today's constant micro-decisions: what to buy, what to wear, what to click on, overload circuits designed for simpler choices. Psychologists call this decision fatigue. It leaves people restless and dissatisfied, even when every option is safe. Anthropologists point to another mismatch: the erosion of close-knit communities. Gatherers relied on face-to-face connections and shared burdens. Anxiety could be mitigated by immediate reassurance from kin. In modern cities, people often live surrounded by strangers, connected more through institutions than through personal bonds. Loneliness is recorded at high levels, even in crowded megapolises. The nervous system interprets isolation as danger because, in ancestral conditions, separation from the group meant vulnerability. Thus, a paradox arises. A person may be safer than ever before in a physical sense, but feel less secure because the old markers of safety are missing. A cohesive community, shared vigilance, and visible cooperation. Even the cultural narrative reinforces this mismatch. Myths and rituals in small groups once provided a framework for interpreting danger and resilience. Modern humans inherit media that thrive on the dramatization of risk. News cycles dominated by catastrophes, entertainment built on tension and fear. These narratives hijack ancient circuits tuned to listen intently when danger is described. A rumor of lions once spread through the camp. Now, it is an urgent headline about market crashes or global unrest. The brain reacts as if both are immediate threats. The most sobering part of all this is that anxiety is not a bug, but a function honed over millennia for our preservation. The mismatch lies in the fact that the calibration is wrong for today's environment. We no longer need to carry constant terror while walking through supermarket aisles or going to bed at night. But evolution has no mechanism for recalibration in just a few generations. As a result, we are a species living with echoes of dangers that no longer exist, still programmed to tense up the sight of shadows even in an age of abundance. Imagine, 10,000 years ago, picking a handful of wild berries. Sweetness would have been rare, fleeting, and precious. Or imagine the relief of finding animal fat after weeks on lean game salt from mineral deposits. The satisfaction of a roasted bone with marrow. In a world of scarcity, these were taste signals. Eat now, store energy, survive tomorrow. However, walk into a modern supermarket, and those same signals are everywhere. Packaged, processed, amplified far beyond their natural forms, and instead of saving us, they are slowly killing us. The question is, why does the food that once saved us now kill us? The roots lie in the evolutionary logic of craving. Humans, like many animals, developed preferences that guided survival. Sweetness signaled sugar, a dense source of calories. Bitterness often warned of toxins, so we learned to avoid it. Salt was essential for nerve and muscle function, but was rare deep inland, so the tongue evolved to value it. Fat contained more than twice the calories per gram compared to carbohydrates or proteins, making it an ideal energy reserve in uncertain times. The craving for these tastes guaranteed that when they were found, they would be eaten, and when they were eaten, they sustained life during famine. Anthropological studies of gathered diets confirm this. The Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies, value honey as a seasonal trophy, consuming it in abundance when available. Arctic gatherers relied heavily on the fat of seals and whales, essential in cold climates. Salt was gathered with difficulty from coastal deposits or traded over long distances. Every taste preference was tuned to scarcity, not abundance. The systems worked because the environment imposed natural limits on access. Agriculture changed the equation. Domesticated grains, legumes, and livestock provided more reliable calories. But the real revolution happened much later, with industrial processing. In the 18th century, sugar production expanded through colonial plantations, turning what was once a rarity into a daily staple. In the 20th century, refined carbohydrates, vegetable oils, and added salts became widespread in processed foods. The environment shifted from scarce to overabundant in just a few generations. Evolution had no time to adjust. The same taste preferences that once saved lives now lead to overconsumption. Biology helps explain why restraint is so difficult. Dopamine pathways in the brain react strongly to sugar and fat, rewarding consumption with pleasure. Neurobiologists describe this as a hedonistic system designed to reinforce adaptive behavior. In the ancestral past, the system balanced between need and opportunity. In the modern world, it is hacked by technologically modified products designed to reach bliss points, precise combinations of sugar, salt, and fat that trigger the strongest reward response. Snack shelves are, in a sense, laboratories exploiting ancient cravings. The consequences are visible worldwide. Over the last century, rates of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular diseases have soared. However, these conditions are not inherently new. Ancient skeletons sometimes show signs of tooth decay, often linked to high consumption of starch or honey. Gout plagued the elite who overindulged in rich food. What is new is the scale. Once limited to rare individuals or classes, dietary mismatch diseases now affect billions. The global food environment has overwhelmed the evolutionary design of taste buds. There is also the paradox of abundance without satisfaction. Research shows that highly processed foods can lead to cycles of craving and overeating without lasting satiety. Our digestive and hormonal systems evolved to process fibrous plants, lean proteins, and slowly digestible carbohydrates. Modern foods, stripped of fiber and concentrated in sugars, rapidly flood the bloodstream, causing a sharp insulin spike followed by an energy crash. The brain interprets this drop as hunger, triggering a new craving. What once served as a survival mechanism becomes a trap. Anthropologists sometimes call this the Paleolithic hangover. We live with bodies and minds adapted to an environment we are no longer in. The craving for sweets is not a mistake. It is ancient wisdom, misplaced in modern abundance. The desire for salt is not irrational. It is an echo of countless ancestors who needed it for life. The taste for fat is not gluttony by design. It is a legacy of survival in lean times. The mismatch is not in the craving itself, but in the context. Let us humbly admit that science cannot yet fully figure out how to recalibrate these systems. Diets modeled after those of ancestors rich in unprocessed plants, moderate in meat, low in added sugar seem to reduce the risk of mismatched diseases. But global lifestyles and economics make such diets difficult to maintain universally. We know enough to recognize the pattern, but not enough to design an easy solution. So we return to the haunting question: if the very desires that saved our ancestors now undermine our health, what does this say about the future of a species living in eternal abundance? Can we adapt behaviorally faster than biology can adapt genetically? Or will we remain trapped by appetites created for a cave we have left, forever torn between the wisdom of survival and the temptations of the supermarket? One way to gauge how deep this mismatch goes is to look at how human cultures have ritualized food. In different societies, feasts mark abundance. Harvest festivals, religious celebrations, weddings. In the ancestral context, these moments were rare punctuation marks in a life limited by scarcity. A feast mattered precisely because it contrasted with ordinary hunger. Today, however, the cultural impulse to celebrate clashes with an environment of constant availability. Every day can resemble a feast, which dulls the very meaning of celebration and forces ancient mechanisms to work until they wear out. Another perspective is provided by archaeology. Stable isotope analysis in ancient skeletons allows scientists to reconstruct diets over millennia. The results show striking diversity: diets emphasizing fish on the coasts, tubers deep inland, meat in cold climates. What they do not show is a pervasive dependence on concentrated sugars, salts, and fats. Even the wealthiest elites of the Bronze Age or Classical Antiquity rarely consumed what modern children can buy with pocket money. The mismatch is not only evolutionary, but also historical. Human taste habits, which guided survival for hundreds of thousands of years, encountered industrial abundance only in the last few generations. Cravings extend beyond energy needs. Anthropologists studying the use of salt in early agricultural societies find evidence of trade networks stretching hundreds of kilometers all to obtain this mineral. Salt was not just a flavor enhancer, but a physiological necessity, critical for hydration and muscle function. Our desire for it reflects a genuine need. But once the modern world made it ubiquitous, added to bread, canned meats, processed snacks, it ceased to be a rare trophy and became a constant surplus. The craving that once drove long journeys and the forging of alliances now leads to chronic hypertension. Even the psychology of comfort food speaks of our ancient heritage. Food high in fat and sugar stimulates reward pathways and reduces short-term stress responses, echoing the evolutionary role of energy storage in difficult times. The modern idea of soothing oneself with chocolate or fried food is a cultural superstructure, built upon a biological truth: calories once equaled safety. The problem is that stress today is rarely followed by hunger. Instead, the comfort response becomes habitual, and the mismatch grows. The humble part of this story is that our addictions are not vices to be scolded, but echoes to be understood. Every craving for sweets is a fossil remain of ancient survival. Every desire for salt is a memory of scarcity. Every hunger for fat is a whisper from ancestors who lived from one harsh winter to the next. Realizing this does not solve the modern dilemma, but it reframes it. The enemy is not the appetite itself, but the environments that turned it into a weapon. And this leaves us with a quiet but complex question: if the world has changed faster than biology, can culture through science, education, and restraint act as a new regulator of desire? Or will the cave we left shape our aspiration long after the cave itself is gone? Close your eyes in a modern bedroom, and you will find that you are surrounded by quiet machines. Clocks glow, chargers blink, streetlights pierce through the curtains, and the faint hum of distant traffic drifts in. But for most of our species' history, night meant something entirely different. Darkness was almost total, broken only by the pale light of the moon or the flicker of a campfire. Sleep flowed in rhythms tuned to the rising and setting of the sun, tied to a cycle of light and dark that has governed all life for billions of years. The haunting question is, why can't our Stone Age bodies sleep in the 21st century? The story begins deep in prehistory. Circadian rhythms, internal cycles lasting approximately 24 hours that govern sleep, hunger, and hormone release are found in both animals and plants. In humans, these rhythms were set by light. Specialized cells in the eye, distinct from those used for vision, detect brightness and send signals to the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock, for hundreds of thousands of years. This system synchronized human activity with the sun. Morning light triggered alertness. Evening darkness prompted the release of melatonin and sleepiness. Campfire light slightly extended the period of wakefulness, but its spectrum was warm and dim, far less disruptive to circadian signals than the harsh blue light of modern lamps. Anthropologists studying modern gatherer groups provide clues to ancestral sleep. Among the Hadza in Tanzania or the San in South Africa, sleep is segmented rather than uniform. People often fall asleep shortly after dark, wake for a period during the night, and then sleep again until dawn. This pattern of first and second sleep, once common in pre-industrial societies, reflects the flexibility of human sleep within natural constraints. Importantly, it occurred in darkness and firelight, not under electric lamps or glowing screens. Sleep was social as well as biological. People slept near kin, and someone was often awake, ensuring safety in the night. The Industrial Revolution and the spread of artificial lighting changed this ancient pattern. In just a centuries, gaslights, and later incandescent bulbs, extended activity far beyond sunset. Working hours shifted, nightlife blossomed, and sleep began to shrink. Studies of 19th century factory towns described workers sleeping few hours than their rural neighbors. Their nights were divided by shifts and long commutes. By the 20th century, electric light became almost ubiquitous, allowing humans to banish darkness at will. Our biology, however, has not changed. The circadian system still reacts to light as if it were sunlight, suppressing melatonin and delaying sleep when exposed to brightness in the evening. The advent of screens intensified this mismatch. Televisions, computers, smartphones, and tablets emit high levels of short-wavelength blue light, the very spectrum most effective at resetting circadian rhythms. Using such devices at night effectively tells the brain it is noon. Studies show that screen exposure before bed delays melatonin release, shortens sleep duration, and fragments sleep quality. For a nervous system calibrated to campfire and moonlight, the glow of a phone is deeply confusing. Insomnia, once a minor complaint, has become a widespread epidemic. Surveys show that nearly 1 in 3 adults in industrial societies experiences chronic difficulty falling or staying asleep. Sleep duration has declined in many populations. The average nightly rest has fallen below 7 hours for large segments of the population. The consequences are vast. Impaired memory, weakened immunity, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and greater vulnerability to mental health disorders. Our Stone Age bodies depend on sleep for repair, yet our modern environment relentlessly disrupts it. It is worth noting that humans are not unique in their need for sleep. Every animal studied sleeps, from insects to mammals. What makes humans special is how we manipulate our environment to suppress natural cycles. No lion or bird can flood its habitat with artificial light. Only humans can turn night into day. And only humans, it seems, can create insomnia as a cultural byproduct. Archaeological remains cannot tell us how well our ancestors slept, but ethnographic comparisons and evolutionary reasoning suggest they were not immune to disruption. Noise, predators, and hunger also interfered with rest. What is different today is the chronic, systemic disruption of circadian rhythms by technology itself. Even architecture plays a role. Modern bedrooms are often isolated from natural light, making mornings dim and evenings bright, the direct opposite of ancestral conditions. Office workers spend most of the day under artificial light, which is weaker than true daylight, and then return home to an environment intensely lit at night. This inversion leaves the circadian clock drifting, unsure of when the day begins or ends. Jet lag, once a rarity, has now become a routine for millions, further confusing biological rhythms. Science is still developing, and we should be humble about what we know. Not all insomnia is caused by light. Stress, irregular schedules, and individual differences also matter. Nevertheless, the convergence of evidence from laboratory studies of melatonin suppression to field studies of gather sleep points to a clear pattern. Our bodies evolved for dark nights and bright days, and we have flipped that equation. The haunting question remains: if sleep is as ancient and essential as breathing, what happens when a species systematically undermines it? Can cultural adjustments, dimming lights, limiting screens, revising work schedules restore what biology demands? Or are we destined to live as insomniacs in the 21st century? Our Stone Age bodies are still waiting for a darkness that never comes. Evolution is often described as a ruthless filter, a process that rewards survival and reproduction by eliminating traits that hinder them. For hundreds of thousands of years, this filter shaped our bodies and minds with unwavering severity. Infants who could not survive an infection did not reach adulthood. People with infertility left no descendants. Genetic disorders that prevented reproduction vanished from populations. Then, within a single century, the filter shifted. Antibiotics cured infections that once killed. Vaccines prevented diseases before they could act. Infertility treatments allowed families to be created by those for whom it was once considered biologically impossible. Glasses corrected poor vision. Surgery fixed defects. And advanced medicine maintained life far beyond reproductive age. A haunting question arises: did we stop evolving when we invented medicine? This assertion is provocative, and Ella Al-Shamahi, along with other evolutionary biologists, has voiced it in interviews. Natural selection, in their view, is now weaker than ever before. Traits that were once harshly selected against, such as infertility, severe allergies, or congenital disorders, no longer impede survival or reproduction to the same extent. If survival is no longer tightly linked to biology, the mechanism of evolution seems muffled. But we must examine closely what this means. Consider infectious diseases. For most of human history, epidemics radically reshaped populations. Archaeology reveals waves of mortality, from tuberculosis, leprosy, and plague. Survivors passed on resistance genes, gradually changing allele frequencies. In the 20th century, antibiotics changed this landscape. Diseases that once decimated populations, streptococcal infections, syphilis, bacterial pneumonias, became treatable. Natural selection lost one of its most powerful filters. Nevertheless, pathogens evolve rapidly, and the arms race continues. Antibiotic resistance is now a global crisis, a reminder that evolution never stops. It only changes the participants. Infertility provides another perspective. By definition, infertility reduces reproductive success. In the past, people who could not conceive simply did not leave genetic descendants. Today, technologies such as in vitro fertilization (IVF) allow many to have children despite biological barriers. As a result, alleles contributing to infertility may persist in the gene pool, rather than being weeded out. From a strict Darwinian perspective, this represents a weakening of natural selection. From a human perspective, however, it is a triumph, a refusal to let biology dictate destiny. Vision provides a more subtle example. Myopia, nearsightedness, is widespread in many modern populations. In the ancestral environment, severe nearsightedness might have reduced the chances of survival by hindering hunting or gathering. Today, glasses, contact lenses, and corrective surgery make this almost irrelevant. Millions of people thrive with a condition that was once disadvantageous. Here, medicine also shifts the balance of selection. But does this mean that evolution has truly stopped? Most evolutionary biologists say no. Selection pressure hasn't disappeared, it has shifted. Human reproduction is still influenced by social, cultural, and economic forces. Genes that provided an advantage in one context may now be neutral, or even disadvantageous in another. The spread of casein sections, for example, allows for the survival of infants with larger heads, potentially changing the selection regarding pelvic size. Global migration mixes gene pools at an unprecedented rate, changing variability in ways unknown to the past. Moreover, medicine extends life beyond the reproductive period, influencing the social environment of survival. Grandparents live long enough to help raise grandchildren, a phenomenon sometimes called the grandmother effect. Although genes may not be selected directly through survival in old age, the cultural and social contributions of older people change the success of the group, which in turn affects the transmission of knowledge, values, and behavior. Evolution is not only genetic, but also cultural, and medicine strengthens the cultural path by keeping more people alive longer. We must remain humble. Evolutionary processes unfold over thousands of years, not decades. Claims that evolution has stopped may underestimate the subtle ways in which selection continues. For example, global studies show that lactose tolerance has spread only over the last 10,000 years, influenced by the consumption of dairy products. Similarly, genes affecting metabolism, immunity, and fertility may still be changing under the pressure of new factors, albeit more slowly and less visibly than in the past. Medicine changes the rules, but it does not cancel the game itself. The question, perhaps, is not whether we have stopped evolving, but whether we are now evolving differently. Instead of selection against weakness, we see the preservation of diversity. Instead of survival linked solely to biology, we see survival through technology and culture. Evolution may consist less in elimination and more in accommodation. This raises profound questions about the future. Will human populations accumulate traits that were previously weeded out, leading to a new dependence on medicine and technology? Or will cultural and technological evolution simply take the place of biological adaptation, creating a species that survives not only thanks to genes, but thanks to inventions? The haunting question remains unresolved. Medicine has indeed softened the severity of natural selection, but it has not erased evolution. It has redirected it, softened it, and intertwined it with culture in a way that no previous species has experienced. The Stone Age survival filter is gone, replaced by antibiotics, vaccines, and reproductive medicine clinics. Whether this will make us freer or more fragile is a question that only time will answer. Another perspective on this issue is provided by population genetics. Even if medicine reduces mortality from certain conditions, gene frequencies still change, simply because not everyone reproduces equally. Access to medicine itself varies drastically across the globe. In some regions, advanced fertility treatments and neonatal care are widespread. In others, basic antibiotics remain in short supply. This unevenness means that evolutionary pressures on different populations are not the same. In essence, medicine has created a new selection environment defined by economics and geography, rather than predators or famine. There is also the question of trade-offs. Some genetic traits that predispose to diseases in modern conditions might once have been advantageous. Sickle cell anemia is a classic example. Carriers of one copy of the gene have increased resistance to malaria, while carriers of two copies suffer from the disease itself. Thanks to modern medicine, more people with this condition survive and reproduce, changing the circulation of the allele. Nevertheless, malaria itself continues to exert selection pressure in endemic regions. Medicine in this case has complicated, but not erased, the evolutionary dynamics. The rise of chronic diseases highlights another shift. Heart disease, diabetes, and many types of cancer often develop later in life, frequently after the completion of the reproductive period. From the perspective of natural selection, these conditions have less significance because evolution primarily cares about traits affecting reproductive success. Medicine allows people to live with such conditions for decades, but the underlying evolutionary logic never concerned post-reproductive survival. This divergence gives rise to uncomfortable questions. Are we carrying into the future a genetic vulnerability that selection would previously have eliminated? Or was this vulnerability always there, simply hidden by a short lifespan? There is also a cultural perspective. Some anthropologists argue that humans have effectively outsourced their evolution to culture. Instead of waiting for genetic changes, we change the environment with tools, institutions, and technologies. Glasses compensate for poor vision. Vaccines compensate for weak immunity. Digital tools compensate for memory limitations. From this point of view, medicine is not the end of evolution, but its new layer. Cultural adaptation on top of biological adaptation. Evolution continues, but its main driver has become not just genes, but the interaction of genes and culture. In the future, genetics and biotechnology may change this equation even more. Gene editing technologies, such as CRISPR, open the possibility of directly altering the human genome, bypassing the slow process of natural selection. This will not stop evolution, but redirect it according to conscious design. Whether humanity should take this path is a philosophical and ethical question, but it highlights the reality. Medicine and evolution are no longer separate stories. They are intertwined, shaping each other in ways our ancestors could not have imagined. It is unclear how sustainable this path is. By softening selection, medicine has given us long lives and wide diversity, but it may also have increased dependence on the very technologies that sustain us. The humble reality is this: evolution did not prepare us for antibiotics, vaccines, or gene editing. These are tools we gave to ourselves, and the long-term consequences of their use are only beginning to manifest. We live in an age where science has achieved feats once unimaginable. Vaccines eradicate diseases that terrified our ancestors. Satellites map the globe in real time, and climate models warn us of long-term planetary changes with startling accuracy. And yet, at the very moment when science possesses such power, a significant part of society is turning away from it. Movements deny climate change, despite overwhelming evidence. Parents refuse vaccines even as preventable outbreaks of disease return. Conspiracy theories thrive, casting laboratories and scientists as villains. The haunting question is, why do tribes distrust science, even when it saves them? The roots of this paradox reach deep into human evolution. Trust in information has never been based on evidence alone. Throughout most of our species' history, the credibility of a statement depended not so much on logic as on who said it. When a tribesman warned of a predator by the river, the decisive factor was not peer-reviewed data, but whether you trusted the speaker as a member of your group. Loyalty outweighed objectivity, and this bias was adaptive. Doubting every word would have wasted precious time. Believing a stranger more than one's own carried the risk of exile. Our brains are wired to value group belonging as the ultimate filter of truth. This ancient mechanism persists today. Sociologists studying vaccine distrust and climate change denial find that beliefs often cluster along tribal lines: religious, political, cultural. When people reject scientific evidence, it is rarely because they cannot understand it. Rather, accepting that evidence would put them in opposition to their community. A mother in a vaccine-skeptical group may feel that trusting science threatens her bond with friends, family, or faith. A farmer in a region dependent on coal may feel that acknowledging climate change betrays neighbors, whose existence depends on fossil fuels. The logic is ancient. It is better to risk being wrong with the group than to be right alone. The 20th century intensified this mismatch. Mass media, which was once thought would unite the world, created competing sources of authority. Television, radio, and then the internet multiplied the number of voices, each claiming legitimacy. Trust in institutions, governments, universities, healthcare agencies at first grew, but plummeted toward the end of the 20th century. Scandals, misinformation, and partisan battles undermined confidence. Into this vacuum rushed tribal identity. Beliefs about vaccines or climatology became not just factual statements, but signs of loyalty. Agreeing with science or denying it became less about data and more about signaling whose side you are on. Anthropology provides instructive parallels. In small societies, knowledge is distributed and contextual. Hunting techniques vary among different tribes, even if the habitat is similar. Rituals and myths encode ecological wisdom, but they are believed not because they are empirically verified, but because they are socially sanctioned. In modern conditions, scientific knowledge functions differently. It requires trust in distant experts, in processes invisible to ordinary people. For many, this kind of trust feels alien. When a scientist in a white coat explains the structure of DNA or climate models, to the evolved brain it may resemble the proclamations of a foreign tribe. The post-truth era, as many scholars now call it, crystallizes this dynamic. Misinformation spreads not because it is convincing in itself, but because it resonates with group identity. A claim about the danger of vaccines persists, not because of overwhelming evidence none exists, but because repeating this signal confirms loyalty to the community of skeptics. Similarly, climate denial persists not because of a lack of data, but because belief coincides with the interests and identity of certain groups. In this sense, distrust of science is not so much a failure of reason as a triumph of tribal logic. Nevertheless, this does not mean that truth does not matter. Science continues to work, whether people believe in it or not. Planes fly, medicines heal, climate systems react to carbon. The tragedy is that, when trust is undermined, the benefits of science become uneven. Communities that reject vaccines suffer from preventable outbreaks. Countries that deny climate change delay adaptation and face harsher consequences. The mismatch between ancient tribal instincts and modern global problems has a very tangible price. As scientists, we must acknowledge another factor. Science has not always lived up to its ideals. History preserves instances of unethical experiments, the suppression of knowledge for political gain, arrogance, and poor communication. These failures provide fertile ground for distrust. Even when modern science strives for transparency to rebuild trust, simply presenting more evidence is not enough. Trust must be earned through humility, openness, and the recognition that humans are tribal by nature. The haunting question is whether humanity can overcome this ancient filter of loyalty. In time to meet global challenges, can billions of Stone Age brains learn to trust evidence more than identity, when survival depends on it? Or will our tribal instincts continue to erode trust, leaving us vulnerable not to lions in the grass, but to crises of our own making? Another way to see this crisis of trust is to examine moments when science achieved brilliant successes yet still met resistance. The eradication of smallpox in the late 20th century stands as one of humanity's greatest triumphs. Thanks to coordinated global vaccination campaigns, a disease that once killed millions vanished. Nevertheless, even during that campaign, rumors spread about the safety of vaccines or hidden agendas. Resistance was born not from evidence, but from suspicion toward the outsiders who brought it. This pattern repeated with polio, measles, and so on. A scientific achievement can destroy a virus, but it cannot destroy the tribal reflex of distrusting what comes from outside the group. Climatology tells a similar story. In the mid-20th century, early models of carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere matched observations remarkably well. By the end of the century, the consensus was clear. Human activity is heating the planet. However, political and cultural divisions quickly overpowered the evidence. Fossil fuel industries funded campaigns of doubt. Communities whose existence depended on coal or oil resisted findings that threatened their economic survival. Over time, denial became less about carbon data and more about identity. In some regions, acknowledging climate change felt like betraying one's community. Science was not wrong in its accuracy, but trust fractured along tribal lines. What makes these episodes so significant is that they show information moves differently than we imagine. We like to think that truth triumphs through the weight of evidence, but in practice, it spreads through social networks. A claim supported by a trusted neighbor, pastor, or politician carries more weight than a graph in a journal. Evolution prepared us to value social trust as the ultimate arbiter. In ancestral groups, this was a winning bet. In global societies, it can be disastrous. The crisis is exacerbated by the speed of modern communication. Social networks allow misinformation to fly across continents in a matter of hours. The tribal instincts behind this are ancient, but the amplification is new. A rumor that once might have stayed within a village now reaches millions, reinforced by echo chambers. Every retweet or repost functions like a nod by the campfire, confirming group identity even if the content is false. The sobering part of this mismatch is that the stakes have risen. Distrust of science in the past might have cost a few lives within a band or a village. Today, it can determine outcomes on a planetary scale. Global warming, the spread of pandemics, antibiotic resistance. The mismatch is no longer local. It is existential, and the haunting question deepens. Can science, a practice built on evidence and uncertainty, learn to coexist with minds designed for loyalty and belonging? Or will trust continue to crumble, leaving our greatest achievements vulnerable to the very instincts that once kept our ancestors alive? Science presents itself as an antidote to tribalism. It should be a method, not an identity, a way of testing claims against reality, rather than a banner under which partisans gather. However, in recent decades, critics, including Ella Al-Shamahi, have raised a disturbing question. Has science itself become a tribe? If so, the very institution designed to overcome bias may now be trapped in the same evolutionary logic that shaped every other human group. The haunting question is, can science survive if it becomes just another tribe among many? The origins of modern science in the 19th century were described as universal. Figures such as Darwin, Pasteur, and Maxwell presented ideas meant to transcend national and cultural boundaries. The Royal Society of London adopted the motto nullius in verba, on no one's word, as a declaration that evidence, not authority, would determine the truth of claims. Theoretically, science was open to all, regardless of background or beliefs. In practice, however, participation was always defined by social context. Science flourished in specific regions: Western Europe, North America, Japan, while other traditions were pushed to the sidelines. Even at its birth, science bore the imprint of culture, class, and politics. In the 20th century, science became more institutionalized. Universities, government agencies, and corporations funded research, setting the agenda and the boundaries. This institutional structure brought immense progress: nuclear physics, molecular biology, space exploration. However, it also deepened the link between science and specific political and cultural identities. In the United States, for example, science was closely associated with secular universities, coastal elites, and progressive politics. By the end of the 20th century, surveys showed that people identifying as conservative became less trusting of scientific institutions, while liberals increasingly adopted science as part of their identity. A practice intended to stand above tribal affiliations was now being absorbed by them. Al-Shamahi points to this as an existential risk. If science is perceived as a left-leaning tribe, then those outside that tribe will treat it with suspicion, regardless of the evidence presented. Vaccine skepticism, climate denial, and the rejection of evolutionary biology thrive not because of the strength of counter-arguments, but because of the perception that science belongs to the other side. When identity defeats data, truth itself becomes tribal currency. There are concrete examples of how exclusion exacerbates this problem. Religious scientists often report hiding their faith in academic circles, fearing ridicule or neglect. Right-wing scholars worry about becoming outcasts or losing their platforms. Controversial figures, such as Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk, become stumbling blocks. Their exclusion reinforces the perception that science only tolerates certain ideological positions. The effect is self-sustaining. The more science appears to belong to one tribe, the less members of other tribes feel invested in its findings. This polarization is not unique to science. Every human institution reflects the evolutionary pull toward us and them. However, for science, the stakes are higher. If bridges break, vaccines fail, or climate predictions go unheeded. Society pays an immediate price. Trust in science cannot afford to split along partisan lines. And yet, from an evolutionary perspective, it is easy to see why this happens. Humans did not evolve to trust abstract methods. We evolved to trust people like us. When scientists speak, listeners often hear not data, but the identity of the speaker. The question is whether science can reclaim its position as a universal method, rather than a partisan identity. Some argue that the solution lies in conscious pluralism, welcoming religious voices, political diversity, and cultural perspectives into the scientific community, provided they adhere to methodological rigor. Others caution that expanding the circle risks diluting standards, allowing ideology to masquerade as evidence. The tension is real. Nevertheless, history shows that diversity of perspectives often enriches science. Fields such as evolutionary biology, medicine, and anthropology have moved forward through the dialogue between competing views, rather than through uniformity. The sobering truth is that science is done by humans, and humans are tribal animals. Even within the scientific community, rival schools, laboratories, and theories fight for prestige, funding, and recognition. Peer review, citation networks, and institutional hierarchies all carry echoes of tribal politics. What distinguishes science is not the absence of these dynamics, but the presence of mechanisms replication, transparency, falsifiability that aim to check them. But if the public sees science primarily as a tribal banner, these mechanisms lose credibility outside the tribe, and the haunting question remains: if science is to guide humanity through crisis, climate change, pandemics, technological risks, it must find a way to overcome the perception of tribal identity. Can it present itself not as left or right, secular or religious, but as a universal method of knowing? Or will it remain, in the eyes of many, just another tribe whose truths are judged not by evidence, but by loyalty? One way to see how thin this line between method and tribe is to look at science in moments of political upheaval. In the early 20th century, Soviet biology became intertwined with ideology through the rise of Lysenko, whose rejection of Mendelian genetics fit Marxist principles of environmental molding. For years, his views dominated Soviet agriculture, suppressing dissent and significantly setting back genetic research. In Nazi Germany, anthropological and medical sciences were perverted to support racial theories. These cases are extreme, but they reveal a truth applicable more broadly. When science is perceived as serving one tribe, its authority collapses outside that tribe, and sometimes within it as well. The Cold War provides another example. Physics became a symbol of national power, and nuclear weapons programs swallowed vast resources. Scientists in the US and the Soviet Union worked under incredible pressure. Their work was viewed not just as discovery, but as the defense of tribal identity at the level of nations. The space race similarly presented science as a tribal competition rather than a universal endeavor. The irony is that genuine breakthroughs were born from this rivalry. Satellite technology, rocketry, and early computers, which benefited humanity as a whole. Nevertheless, such a presentation ensured that millions understood science not as neutral research, but as a weapon for one side. Even in education, the tribal approach defined debates. The teaching of evolution in schools has long been a stumbling block, especially in the United States. The Scopes monkey trial of 1925 pitted modernist and traditionalist identities against each other, with evolutionary biology at the center. Nearly a century later, similar disputes continue. For many, resistance to teaching evolution is not so much about fossil evidence as it is about defending tribal values against what is perceived as an external ideology. The rejection or acceptance of evolution becomes a marker of identity, rather than a neutral judgment of data. These examples show how easily science can be pulled into human patterns of belonging and suspicion. The danger lies not only in external rejection, but also in internal insularity. If scientists reject or ridicule entire segments of the population, whether for political, religious, or cultural reasons, they risk reinforcing the perception that science is the property of a single tribe. The challenge then is to maintain rigor without falling into uniformity, to welcome diversity of background without sacrificing the standards that distinguish science from faith. From this view emerges a humble paradox. Science is our best tool for overcoming tribal limitations, and yet, it cannot escape the tribal instincts of those who practice and interpret it. The very existence of peer review and replication is a testament to the need for protection against bias, because bias is our default state. The hope lies in the fact that an open acknowledgement of this humanity, rather than a pretense that science is an infallible oracle, can rebuild trust across tribal boundaries. The haunting question that follows is, can humility itself become science's strongest shield? Or will tribal instincts prove too strong even for a method that once promised to overcome them? Imagine you are standing on a threshold dividing time 10,000 years ago. On one side lies the world we inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. Small groups, nomadic life, landscapes that were walked upon rather than owned. On the other side lies something completely different. The first cultivated fields, the first permanent dwellings, the first signs of surplus that allowed a few people to move away from self-sufficiency and devote themselves to new pursuits. This shift is sometimes called humanity's greatest leap forward, but we must also ask, was it our greatest compromise? The haunting question is, did civilization save us or break us? The agricultural revolution is often painted as a triumph. Domesticated plants and animals allowed humans to escape the precarious cycles of wild food supplies. Grain fields produced calories more predictably than hunting. Herds provided meat, milk, hides, and draft power. Villages became possible, then cities, then megapolises. The population grew to sizes unimaginable for small bands of gatherers. In this new context, the foundations of writing, mathematics, and governance emerged. Without agriculture, there would be no pyramids, no libraries, no global cities. Civilization, in the simplest sense, required fields, but archaeology shows that the transition was neither sudden nor universally accepted. For thousands of years, communities wavered between gathering and farming, mixing practices and resisting full commitment. Some groups moved to agriculture only to abandon it later when it proved unstable. The shift was gradual and messy, and perhaps for good reason. Early farmers were often shorter and less healthy than their gatherer contemporaries. Their skeletons show signs of malnutrition, arthritis, and infectious diseases. Sedentary life in cramped settlements and proximity to domestic animals became a breeding ground for pathogens. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and the flu all trace their origins to societies that emerged after domestication. The very act of settling created new vulnerabilities. From one point of view, it was a deal with fate. In exchange for stability and scale, humans accepted a leaner diet, harder physical labor, and an increased risk of disease. From another point of view, it was a leap into a world of opportunity. Agriculture created surpluses, and surpluses created specialization. Once not everyone had to farm, some could devote themselves to other work, making tools, building temples, composing songs, carving myths into stone. The flourish of art and philosophy that we celebrate today would be unthinkable without that initial compromise. The paradox of civilization lies in this trade-off. On one hand, it sustained billions of lives. On the other hand, it gave rise to stress, inequality, and alienation unknown to small groups of gatherers. Hierarchies emerged as surpluses concentrated. Elites stored grain while workers toiled. Kings and priests claimed divine authority, shaping societies where obedience often meant more than kingship. For most of history, since the start of farming, the majority of people lived not in freedom, but in systems of taxation, tribute, or forced labor. Civilization brought stability, but not always justice. Archaeologists describe early cities like Uruk or Mohenjo-Daro as marvels of organization, streets, granaries, temples, plumbing systems. But they also find inequality inscribed into the very architecture. Centralized power required new forms of control, and control brought conflict. Wars over land and resources became commonplace. Walls were built not only to protect against outsiders, but also to keep one's own people in check. Gatherers also knew conflict, but rarely on such a scale. Civilization made possible cathedrals and empires, beauty and conquest. However, to reduce history to a mere tragedy would be a mistake. In these new conditions, human creativity flourished. Writing emerged not as poetry, but as bookkeeping to track grain. But it gave us literature and philosophy. Monumental architecture, funded by surpluses, gave us wonders like Stonehenge, Angkor, and Machu Picchu. Systems of law, though often harsh, created predictability that small groups could not maintain at larger levels. In short, civilization made humanity greater than it was before, but at a specific price. From the perspective of evolutionary mismatch, this compromise still shapes us today. Our bodies and minds are still tuned to the rhythms of gatherers. However, our environment reflects a 1,000-year legacy of cities and agriculture. We carry within us an immune system prepared for pathogens introduced by livestock. We inhabit social structures formed by surpluses and hierarchies, rather than just kingship. The stress of crowded, unequal societies echoes in modern life in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. The compromise made 10,000 years ago still manifests in our bones and institutions. The humble reality is this: we cannot step outside of this deal. Without agriculture and civilization, none of us would be here. Billions of lives are possible only thanks to those early decisions to till fields and build cities. At the same time, the coarse disease, inequality, alienation cannot simply be cast aside. This is the shadow side of the very abundance we value. And so we come to the haunting question: did civilization save us or did it break us? Perhaps the answer is that it did both, and that humanity now lives eternally in the balance of that choice. The fields of 10,000 years ago are reflected in today's skyscrapers. Whether we will flourish in them or collapse under their weight remains unclear. One way to gauge the scale of this deal is to notice how many times it was made independently. Agriculture did not arise in a single cradle only to spread in straight lines. Instead, it appeared in many places with different plants, climates, and societies, suggesting the ubiquity of the factors pushing toward it. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley became the foundation of the first farming villages. In East Asia, rice and millets sustained growing populations. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash became the three sisters feeding Mesoamerican civilizations. In Africa, sorghum and yams sustained communities long before contact with Eurasia. Each case shows how humans make the same crucial calculation: stability through cultivation, even at the cost of certain sacrifices. Archaeological data shows that farming was not always inevitable. Gatherers living near fertile farming regions sometimes resisted the transition for centuries. Why? Because the benefits were not always immediate. Farming tied people to plots of land, exposed them to seasonal failures, and required year-round labor. Gatherers, who enjoyed a diverse diet and mobility, could easily see farming as a burden. Only when population density grew or wild food supplies dwindled did this compromise begin to make sense. In this sense, civilization was not so much a leap forward as it was a turn around a corner under the pressure of circumstances. Another perspective is ecological. Farming allowed humans to multiply, but it also changed entire landscapes. Forests were cleared, rivers were diverted, and soils were tilled to exhaustion. Domesticated plants and animals spread across continents, displacing wild species. From an ecological point of view, agriculture became the beginning of human activity as a planetary force. The dawn of civilization cannot be separated from the decline of biodiversity, a process that began thousands of years before the industrial era. And here again lies the paradox. The very practices that sustain the growth of human numbers often undermine the ecosystems that fed them. Civilization also changed time itself. Gatherers lived by seasonal rhythms, punctuated by migrations and resource cycles. Farmers introduced the calendar, dividing time into planting, harvesting, and storage. This change may seem trivial, but it created new ways of organizing human life. Deadlines, schedules, and obligations stretched years into the future. Archaeologists studying early Mesopotamian tablets find records of grain to be repaid months later, debts and obligations tracked by clay tokens. Civilization brought not only surpluses, but also bureaucracy, not only food security, but also anxiety about obligations extending beyond immediate kin. What evokes humility is how irreversible this compromise has become. Once the population exceeded the carrying capacity of gathering, there was no turning back, even when individuals abandoned farms during droughts or wars. The system as a whole continued to expand. The deal was locked in, shaping generations who could imagine no alternative. We still live in this legacy, enjoying the fruits of stability while bearing the burden of its costs. And the haunting question grows sharper. If civilization was a deal we struck, are we its masters, or does it master us? Did we shape the fields, or did the fields shape us? The available evidence suggests that both are true. Evolution is a story told in deep time, carved into bones and genes over hundreds of thousands of years. However, we now live in a world where change happens in decades, not millennia. Technology reshapes landscapes overnight. Medicine changes lifespans in a single generation. And climate change shifts survival conditions faster than any past ice age. In this context, a haunting question arises. Are we still evolving, or has the process that shaped us slowed to a standstill? On one side of the argument are those who claim that natural selection has weakened. Throughout most of human history, survival and reproduction were precarious. Disease, famine, predators, and injury weeded out traits that hindered endurance or fertility. Today, many of these pressures are mitigated or eliminated. Antibiotics treat infections, infertility treatments overcome reproductive barriers, and global food networks prevent famine in many regions. If survival no longer depends closely on genetic variation, the classic Darwinian mechanism seems muffled. Evolution, from this perspective, plods along barely noticeably, if it continues at all. However, the story is more complex. Evolution does not require catastrophic pressure. It requires only differential reproduction. Even small deviations accumulate over time. Research in population genetics shows that subtle selection continues. For example, genes associated with lactose tolerance spread rapidly in dairy-consuming populations even within the last few thousand years. Genes influencing high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans and Andeans changed their frequency over similarly short intervals. These are not ancient shifts, locked in the Stone Age, but ongoing adaptations visible in the Holocene and later. The assumption that evolution has ceased underestimates its persistence. The modern environment introduces new selective pressures, though they are often indirect. Urban life, for instance, exposes people to pollutants, noise, and crowding. Certain genetic variants may provide resilience to these stresses. Diets rich in processed foods may create metabolic pressures that influence reproductive success in subtle ways. Global migration mixes gene pools, creating combinations never before tested by natural selection. The speed of cultural and environmental change complicates the picture, but does not cancel the basic logic. If some individuals leave more surviving children than others, evolution continues. Another dimension is cultural and technological evolution, which moves much faster than genetic evolution. Glasses compensate for poor vision, isolating this trait from selection. Digital tools augment memory, reducing the selective advantage of mental recall. Gene editing, if it becomes widespread, could bypass the randomness of mutations altogether, introducing traits by conscious design. From this perspective, the center of evolution is shifting. Biological changes are still occurring, but cultural and technological systems are increasingly directing human adaptation. Instead of waiting for natural selection, we adjust the environment, tools, and medicines to fit our needs. Some thinkers argue that this represents a new phase self-directed evolution, whether through selective breeding in agriculture, reproductive technologies in humans, or the emerging possibilities of synthetic biology. Humans are no longer just shaped by evolution, but are beginning to shape it consciously. The ethical implications are profound. Who decides which traits are desirable? How do we guard against inequality if only some can afford enhancements? And what unforeseen consequences will arise from altering complex systems with limited foresight? The possibility of human-steered evolution raises as many questions as it answers. Nevertheless, even as we imagine a future of genetic engineering, a humble truth remains. We cannot predict which traits will prove most important. Climate change may redraw the lines of selection, rapidly altering the environment. Rising sea levels, shifting disease vectors, and food instability may favor resilience in ways we cannot foresee. Technology may mitigate some of these pressures, but not all. In this sense, the future of human evolution is intertwined with the fate of our civilization. We may adapt not only through genes, but through how well we manage the world we have built. There is also the role of drift, the random fluctuation of traits across generations. In large populations, drift matters less, but in small, isolated groups, it can lead to significant changes. Global interconnectedness reduces isolation, but genetic substructures still exist. Religious communities with high birth rates, for example, can change gene frequencies simply through differential reproduction. These quiet, subtle processes remind us that evolution does not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it is the accumulation of small deviations, invisible over centuries. The haunting question then is not simply whether we are still evolving, but in what direction. Are we drifting toward greater dependence on technology, creating a species that survives less by biology and more by culture? Are we accumulating traits that once would have been fatal, but are now sustained by medicine and infrastructure? Or are we adapting in ways we do not yet see, responding to pressures so new and rapid that their effects remain hidden? We should be careful not to imagine ourselves outside of evolution, as if we had stepped off its stage. Evolution is not a choice, but a process. The fact that we discuss it, study it, and imagine its future is itself a product of the brain that evolution gave us. Perhaps the question is not whether we are still evolving, but whether we can learn to live with this paradox. A species shaped by ancient pressures is now so deeply changing its own environment that it may become the primary agent of its own future. Asking whether humans are still evolving is also asking how flexible evolution itself can be in the face of cultural dominance. One concept often discussed in evolutionary biology is gene-culture coevolution. The idea that cultural practices can create entirely new selection pressures. The domestication of livestock, for instance, created a constant source of milk, which in turn favored the spread of lactose tolerance genes in some populations. Today, similar feedback loops may still be at work. Urban environments filled with artificial light, pollution, and sedentary lifestyles may exert a quiet selective force, even if we do not yet see the long-term results. The biological consequences of living in megapolises may only become apparent centuries from now. There is also the matter of reproductive choice. In gatherer bands, reproduction was largely determined by ecological limits, nutrition, infant mortality, and seasonal cycles. In modern societies, birth rates are influenced by education, access to contraception, economic opportunities, and cultural norms. Some communities maintain high fertility, while others approach demographic decline. These differences change the relative contribution of populations to future gene pools. Evolution in this sense is still operating, but it is mediated by values and choices as much as by biology. This is a departure from the past, but it still fits the principles of differential reproduction. Another area of current research is immunity. Global travel and interconnected populations expose humans to pathogens from all over the world. Pandemics like the flu or COVID-19 show how quickly diseases can sweep through society. While medicine reduces mortality, not all individuals react to infection or vaccination in the same way. Variations in immune response, shaped by genetics, may still influence survival and reproduction, albeit in subtle ways. Pathogens evolve rapidly, and humans continue to adapt in response. Even if the scale of impact has decreased compared to past centuries, some scientists suggest that the greatest changes in human evolution may come not from external pressures, but from our own inventions. The mapping of the human genome, advances in gene therapy, and the potential for embryo editing all create the possibility of completely bypassing natural selection. In such a scenario, humans could accelerate adaptation by introducing traits intentionally. However, this raises a paradox. Is a directed genetic change still evolution? Or is it something else entirely? The boundaries blur when culture, technology, and biology are so tightly intertwined. One thing is clear. Humans are unlikely to remain static, whether through drift, subtle selection, or conscious intervention. Change will occur. The form it takes may differ from the slow rhythms of the Pleistocene, but the principle that populations change from generation to generation is inescapable. The haunting question is not whether we are evolving, but whether we will recognize the likeness of the humans who come after us, and whether they will still see themselves in us. Imagine yourself at night, sitting in a quiet apartment high above a city of millions. Outside, the glow of artificial light hides the stars, the echoes of sirens and traffic sound where owls or wolves once would have been. But inside your head, the mind that listens is not new. It is old. So old that it was built for caves and small campfires, for a couple of dozen faces known by name, for rhythms of hunger and abundance, for the sounds of predators in the dark. We are, in every measurable sense, the last cavemen. The haunting question is, what does it mean to carry a Stone Age mind into a world of cities? Evidence of our mismatch is everywhere. Our bodies still react to stress with adrenaline and cortisol, as if a lion were lurking behind the door. Our pupils still dilate in the dark, even though electricity ensures we need not fear stumbling upon predators. Our brains crave sugar, salt, and fat rewards from a world of scarcity, though they now surround us in abundance. Even as sleep is tuned to the light of campfires and the moon, yet we flood our nights with the blue light of screens. It is as if evolution prepared us for one test, and civilization slipped us a completely different one. But being mismatched cavemen is not just a problem. It is also the key to our resilience. Our ancestors survived droughts, ice ages, and volcanic winters. They crossed deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges with tools no more complex than stone blades and wooden spears. They endured climates and crises far harsher than most of us will ever know. The fact that we still carry these Stone Age instincts within us speaks not of fragility, but of endurance. We are here because the cavemen persevered and because their instincts guided them through it all. What we have lost is the scale of life that shaped us. For most of history, humans lived in groups small enough to know every voice. Stories, gossip, and songs bound these groups together. Decision-making was local. Conflicts were resolved face to face. Today, we inhabit societies of millions or billions, where we are governed by strangers and most voices remain unknown. This shift has bred alienation, but it has also made possible art, science, and technology on scales our ancestors could not have imagined. The paradox of cavemen in an urban world is that we lost intimacy to gain opportunity. There is a temptation to romanticize the past, to imagine that gatherers lived in leisure and health compared to the stresses of modernity. However, archaeological data reminds us of the opposite. Life in the caves was short, vulnerable to injury, infection, and hunger. Children often died young. The elderly were a rarity. We must resist the illusion that our ancestors lived in a utopia. However, the world they lived in was perfectly suited to their minds. Their fears matched their environment. Their stress was acute, not chronic. Their communities were small enough to maintain trust. In this sense, today's mismatch is real, not because the past was perfect, but because the present often confuses instincts that once worked well. By calling ourselves the last cavemen, we are not saying we should return to the caves. That is both impossible and undesirable. We are saying that we must live with the tension of an ancient mind in a modern world. The city around us is built of steel and glass, but inside, our neurochemistry still responds to shadows and whispers, to a sense of belonging and loss. The skyscraper is new, but the heart beating within it is old. What, then, does this mean for the future? It means humility. We cannot assume that technology alone will solve the problems of mismatch. Medicine can extend life, but it cannot erase anxiety rooted in evolutionary logic. Cities can provide abundance, but they cannot cancel cravings shaped by scarcity. Social networks can connect billions, but they cannot rewrite the trust systems of small tribes. To live as cavemen in an urban world is to live with paradox and to recognize that we do not have all the answers. Perhaps the lesson of being the last caveman is not one of despair, but of perspective. If our ancestors could survive an ice age with fire and stone, then we can survive the mismatches of the 21st century. If they could endure scarcity, we can endure abundance. If they could carry the burden of fear at night and still tell stories by the campfire, then we can carry our anxieties and still create art, science, and compassion. The mismatch is real, but so is the resilience. And so we conclude with a haunting question. What will future sapiens think of us? Will they look back and see us as failures, struggling with instincts in an environment of our own making? Or will they see us as a bridge between the cave and whatever comes next, a generation that learned to carry an ancient mind into new worlds? The truth is, we do not know. We only know that every human living today is a descendant of survivors, cavemen who persevered, and that their fire still burns within us. There is another way to see ourselves as the last caveman, not by what we have lost, but by what we still retain. Even in the most populous cities, surrounded by noise and concrete, people seek out fragments of the ancestral world. We plant trees in parks. We keep animals in our homes. We gather around glowing screens as if they were campfire light. Weekends are spent hiking, camping, or simply walking, rituals that reconnect us with the landscapes our bodies still remember. Even the popularity of meditation, yoga, and mindfulness can be read as attempts to recreate the rhythms of attention our ancestors practiced instinctively while tracking prey, waiting, or contemplating a flame. In this behavior, we see continuity, a reminder that the cave never fully left us. Our storytelling is also deeply ancestral. Myths, novels, films, and digital games are filled with archetypes drawn from the world of small groups and immediate dangers. Heroes go on quests. Tribes fight over scarce resources. Families protect one another from predators and strangers. The scale may be cosmic, but the structure remains Stone Age. In a way, every time we tell stories, we return to the cave, gathering around the symbolic campfire of the imagination. What we have also carried forward is cooperation. Despite our conflicts, humans remains the most cooperative primates. We create organizations, charities, scientific collaborations, and global aid networks. This instinct for cooperation, born in caves and camps, is what allows billions to coexist today, however imperfectly. If our minds are mismatched for cities, they are also hardwired for empathy, and this wiring gives hope that we can manage the challenges of modern life. The irony is that the very traits that make us mismatched for the modern world, anxiety, cravings for excess, tribal loyalty, are the same traits that once ensured our survival. Fear of the dark made us cautious. Cravings for fat and sugar helped us survive winters. Tribal loyalty bound groups together when resources were scarce. None of these instincts are mistakes. They are echoes of strategies that worked long before cities, before writing, before civilization itself. The task now is not to erase them, but to understand them, to live with them consciously rather than blindly. In this sense, calling ourselves the last cavemen is not so much an accusation as an invitation. It reminds us that beneath the skyscrapers and satellites, we remain a species forged by campfire light, kinship, and the struggle for survival. It asks us to look within ourselves with humility, recognizing both the wisdom and the limits of the instincts that brought us this far. And it invites us to carry these instincts forward with care, not as relics to be discarded, but as companions on the journey toward whatever awaits us after the cave. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking along this timeline with me, for diving into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you sleep, helped you in your studies, or just helped you step out of the noise for a moment, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with other sapiens in your life. And tell me, are you listening to this before bed, while working, or in some corner of the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. See you in the next story.